Well, we better get going. We had almost 100 RSVPs, so people are arriving, hopefully. Good morning. I am Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center, on whose behalf I welcome you this morning. We have a very interesting session on economic and political realities shaping the plans of the Bolsonaro administration. For that, we have three panel discussions, starting with one led by Antonio Spilimbergo, the Assistant Director of International Monetary Fund and the leader of the IMF mission to Brazil. The bios are here. I will not read them, but I can assure you they are all very qualified people, very qualified speakers on the topic they will present today. After Antonio, who will give us an overview of the Article 4 review of the consultations of the Brazilian economy, we'll have Isa Karpovsky, senior economist of the European Department at the IMF, and Damiano Sandri, senior economist at the IMF also. Well, then we will continue with a second panel featuring the Oxford Handbook on the Brazilian economy. The editors are here, Edmund Aman, also Carlos Azzoni and Geraldo Marta, and we will finish with a little overview on how the economics and the politics play together. We will have David Fleischer, Chris Garman. I would like to, just before I pass the floor to Antonio, to tell you that we would like to dedicate this session to the memory of Professor Werner Baer. He's one of the original Brazilianists, a generation of American scholars dedicated themselves to understanding Brazil and explaining Brazil to Americans and other audiences. Professor Werner Baer passed away about 2 years ago, and he was the original inspiration for the handbook that Ed and Carlos and Geraldo will speak about. But without much further ado, I assume that you are all informed on the recent events in Brazil, and the challenge is how to get a message of change that came from the polls, from the elections, expressed by the election of Jair Bolsonaro, into reality. The team is being assembled in Brazil. They are actually in the process of announcing ministers and selecting technical people in the various departments. But I think it's important to start with the big picture that the IMF can offer us of what is the outlook currently as they observed in their consultations with the Brazilian government just recently. And for that, I would like to invite Antonio Spilimbergo to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo. It's a big pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center. And my name is Antonio Spilimbergo. I coordinated the mission, the work for the IMF in Brazil. And I'm going to present some overall conclusions from our Article 4 mission, which took place in April. This is well before the election, so I chose some three particular aspects which are held before and after the elections. After me, Damiano Sandri will talk about structural reform and a way of prioritizing structural reform, and Isa Karpowitz will focus on public sector wages. So the three facts that I would like to focus on are the following. First, historically, it's disappointing growth, and I will argue that has been low compared to other countries for a series of reasons. My understanding that the book that will be presented later will discuss this in more detail. Second, I will point out the weak recovery and why this is the case. And third is the adverse debt dynamic, which will be the big challenge for the next government. First, historically disappointing growth. If you look at Brazil, starting in 1980, the growth here is, you can see in this slide, growth has been surprisingly stable, somewhat, around 2.6% per year. And you had a recession, you had booms, but at the end it goes back to the same trend, which is about 2.6%. Nowadays we are in a historically low moment. As you can see, we are about 8 to 9% below the trend, and in a few years, if the growth continues at this rate, will be at about 10%. So it's a second topic that I will discuss, is why it's so difficult to go back to the trend. Has the trend changed? This has big implications for fiscal consolidation and so on. Why I say that the growth has been very disappointing? First of all, it's not when is very disappointing with respect to what Brazil was to do before 1980, which was much higher, and is disappointing with respect to what other countries, other developing emerging markets are doing. And here, look, Brazil, this is the average growth in the last 40 years, basically. And you see Brazil overall growth is lower than Mexico, lower than Chile, much lower than Korea and China, and just marginally higher than Argentina. This is very disappointing. Considering also that Brazil had the demographic bonus, this is a well-known fact, and it's very disappointing, and it's part of the biggest challenge for any government in the future. Why? If you look at dig a little bit deeper, the reason why Brazil growth has been disappointing economically, mechanically, are due to two facts. One is that low factor productivity growth. Brazil has been very, productivity has been very stagnant. Even more stagnant if you correct for accumulation of human capital. So for a series of reasons that we will investigate later, growth has productivity is low. And second, also investment to GDP ratio has been very low compared to other countries. As you see, Brazil is just higher than Argentina, but all other emerging markets have much higher investment ratio. So people do not invest in Brazil because it's low productivity. The two things are connected. And this is even more worrisome because if historically investment to GDP ratio was about 19 to 20%, after the crisis is 15 to 16% and is low. So a 3% lower investment to GDP ratio means a lot for growth in the future. So let me go to the second topic. Growth has been disappointing with respect to the past, with respect to the peer countries, and the reason is that low productivity and low investment rate. Let me go to the other factor. Other issue I highlighted is the recovery has been much slower than usual. Here, what we did is to plot the quarter GDP growth for various episodes of recession. We take the 91 recession, the 99, the 2008, 2014, and we took the last quarter of growth. So, as you can see, in all the previous recessions, you have some slowdown, but after 2-3 quarters, growth picked up. In the last recession, is very disappointing. It's highly unusual with respect to Brazilian standard. So not only we start with a low growth, low trend growth, but this recession was particularly damaging. Not only the depth of the recession, but also the recovery that you can see here. So deep recession and low growth. Now, I come before working for Brazil, I work on Europe for quite a bit during the global financial crisis. And there, the big debate was, well, you have a big drop, it's financial conditions, but once you have a big drop, you have a big bounce back. And what we learned from the European experience that you didn't have the bounce back for a series of reasons, but we didn't have it. And we are observing the same dynamic here in Brazil now. So going a little bit deeper, look at the consumption and investment. As you can see here, we do the same exercise. We plot what are consumption rate during the recession, this recession compared with the other recessions. And indeed, the recession is lower than the other recession, but even lower, and this is the very peculiar thing of this recession that we highlight in our report, is investment. Investment, both public and private, went down. And is not recovering, is still now much lower than it used to be. I mentioned it's about 3 percentage points of GDP. This is due to a combination of factors. There is a public sector, which is as financial, the fiscal consolidation is, but it's also big companies like Petrobras, which is curtailing. Probably the corruption scandals are taking a big toll on investment. And but this is very worrisome because, as I argued before, one reason why Brazil didn't grow much in the past is a low investment rate with respect to other countries. The bad news is that during this recession, this investment rate has gone even lower. Now, I focus just on investment, but what is concerning is also the result on employment and unemployment, because at the end of the day, low investment, low growth in a country which is still growing demographically means unemployment. And here what we did is to plot employment in this recession compared to other recessions. And you can see this, it was done okay until 2 years ago, and afterwards the employment rate is lower than it was with the previous recession. And this is also quite indicative. You had a peak in employment. Here we choose total employment, but afterwards we are still well below the peak of people who were employed just before the recession. This means a lot of unemployment, persistent unemployment, because in the meantime the labor force increase, and if you create less jobs, you have more unemployment. This is one factor holding back the recovery, by the way, because less employment means less consumption, and given that Brazil is a closed economy, this is taking its toll. So the big challenge is to, at the end of the day, let's talk about fiscal first. Fiscal, debt dynamics are problematic. Let's forget about from now on, here is our projections. Here is what happened. And we took our preferred measure, which is the primary balance, which excludes expenditure on interest rate, which, as you know, has its own dynamic. And the truth is that in the last 4 years, it went up and down, but there is not a clear trend. So you see, it was minus 2% in 2015, it went up, it went down, and also this year, we are not on the path. Also this year, there was not a path toward consolidation, despite all this debate. And now, in our projections, what we do is we take for granted, for good, the projection of the government, what are the intentions of the government. So we assume a gradual fiscal consolidation of about 1.5% per year. And with okay, I'll stay with the debt and the back. So the excitement of the debt, and so the message here is that let's suppose that Brazil is able to do what the present government hoped for, which is a gradual fiscal consolidation respecting the T2. As you know, the T2 on the federal expenditure. Even with this, The message is that you see the gross debt keeps on going on. So even if Brazil is able to do the fiscal consolidation respecting the T2, still the debt to GDP ratio, which is represented by this red line, goes up at a very high level, almost 98%, almost, which is considered very dangerous. So the message is here that the past doesn't look so good, but even given the benefit for the doubt for the future, we are in a very risky zone, in an area where usually emerging markets have some problems. So this calls for stronger fiscal consolidation to avoid to arrive in this zone about 100%. Now, let's go a little bit. This is an exercise we did trying to see how room has Brazil. It's a little bit technical. Here we said, well, let's suppose that growth is 2.2%. And the real interest rate, as it is now on the debt, is about 5%. How much primary surplus need Brazil to stabilize the debt starting in 5 years from now? It's about 1.6%. But now the deficit is about 2.4%. So just to stabilize the debt, given the assumption as they are now, we need a lot of fiscal effort. Now, let's suppose that you are able to, Brazil is able to grow more, not to 2.2, but 3%, which is higher than the historical average and higher of what we presume it will grow. Well, even in that case, the fiscal surplus has to be about 1%. Given that now we are minus 2.4, it means a fiscal consolidation of 3.4, which is a large number, which is even bigger than the T2. So the message for this is that using some realistic assumption on the interest rate and the real growth of rate, you need a fiscal consolidation which is even higher of what the T2 is implying. To see this, let me show this. Just these are the revenues, federal revenues, and here is the baseline federal expenditure. Here is our calculation how much you can take out of the expenditure by doing just pension reform as the old proposal. Here we add a little bit more. Let's see how you need to shave, how you can shave expenditure just containing wage bill is the topic that Isa will talk about. And here is some exercise taking out limited tax exemptions, the famous tax expenditure, which are a big item in Brazil. But even in this case, you see that expenditure will go down, but not dramatically. And in order to have a primary surplus on top of these three measures, you need to do other measures, which are yet to be identified. So the message here is that T2 is not enough. Expenditure cutting is not enough. Probably you need to act also on revenue side. Okay? Now, let's give a good news, because we had to give good news also. And here is on monetary policy. After years, Brazil finally has reached a stable inflation. Not only currently, but also future inflation is anchored. All expectations indicate that inflation is within the band. And this is a good news, because most of public debt is domestic. Having stabilized inflation means that they can progressively reduce public expenditure on interest rate. And this is, finally, one thing that was highlighted in the report, and especially in the FSAP, in addition to the regular Article 4 consultation, this year Brazil had what is called financial sector assessment. What we do is to go into more detail into the financial sector, and we try to detect what are the problems, the issues, the structural weaknesses, and the challenges. One issue which is very important to keep in mind that the financial sector in Brazil, for a series of reasons, has not intermediated efficiently the funds. And if you look at the net interest margin of Brazil, meaning the difference between what the banks are spending and lending. And it's one of the highest among emerging markets. For a series of reasons that we discuss in the report, but it's something that is you need to address, the new government will need to address at a certain point to improve the efficiency of the financial system. Finally, while these are our new projections, we had to, the staff report, as I said, was finalized in May, basically. Since then, we had to cut a little bit the projection for this year because of the second quarter was not so good as expected, and I found it useful to just to give an update. As you see here, from here on, we are really optimistic. We believe in the government. It's almost a statement. We take for good what the government projections are, and despite this, the gross debt is going to a level which is very high. This is a big message that we need to give. The other very positive thing is that the current account deficit has been very contained. In the past was a big issue, and now is below 2%. The negative part is that part of this is because of the low growth. If Brazil doesn't grow much, imports are compressed, and so the current account is good. So we would like to have this current account, but with much higher growth. So conclusion, the 3 points I gave are historically weak GDP growth because of productivity and low investment rate. Second, this is a historically deep recession followed by historically weak recovery, and possibly the weakness of the recovery is even more surprising. And this is due to a mix of factors, legacy from the past and also uncertainty for the future. Hopefully now there is less uncertainty, and so the recovery can take hold, and this is our big hope. And the big challenge will be at the same time high and increasing public debt. So Brazil will have this challenge to fiscally consolidate and at the same time to resume growth. And so to have a conservative fiscal tightening fiscal policy, and at the same time to have a accommodative monetary policy in order to favor a push growth. Okay.
Is it fine if I use this mic or the end one? Okay, thank you. I'll leave it here. First of all, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this event. So as Antonio mentioned in his presentation, Brazil faces very low levels of economic growth, especially potential economic growth. And therefore, what we've been focusing on in our work is to think about the agenda for structural reforms that Brazil may think of embarking on to increase potential economic growth and generate more jobs in the economy. Now, in the case of Brazil, like many other emerging markets, there's of course a long list of potential structural reforms that authorities could try to do to raise economic growth and create jobs. And the key issue, though, is that it's very important to think about how to set priorities as we look ahead at the process of economic reforms. Why is that so? Well, because the alternative of trying to do multiple reforms at the same time is not very viable. And that is at least for two reasons. One is that, as you all know very well, when you try to do structural reforms, you tend to raise strong political oppositions by those interest groups that they benefit from the status quo. And so if the government tries to tackle multiple reforms at once, well, it can really face a very strong political backlash by multiple sectors of the society. So it's wise to give priorities and make sure that you operate, one reform at a time. A second equally important consideration for not doing multiple reforms at once is that to implement structural reforms, it requires some administrative capacity. You need to be able to legislate, you need to be able to implement the reforms and to follow through with enforcement. From this, the need to think about how to set priorities for structural reforms. Now, if you ask that question to a common economist, you tend to get a fairly straightforward answer, which looks fairly reasonable, which is just think about the economics and look at whichever reform can give you the highest economic impact on economic growth and job creation. Now, that sounds all fairly reasonable, but it's also relatively naive because it fails to acknowledge the political economy aspects of structural reforms, the fact that some reforms can actually be politically very costly. So what we do in this work is to lay forward a two-step approach in identifying priorities for structural reforms that as one step looking indeed at the economic impact of reforms, but we're going to complement this first step with a second layer of analysis that tries to give an assessment of the extent of political support for different reforms. The goal here, therefore, is to give priority to those reforms that can deliver the highest economic impact, but also the lowest political cost. Now, in the presentation, we're also going to discuss how the choice of structural reform priorities can also be shaped by some legislative considerations as well as fiscal implications. And I'll be clear about these issues as I move forward in the presentation. And of course, this presentation will be focused on the case of Brazil, but in principle, the same methodology can be applied to other emerging markets in the world. Now, moving with the first step of the analysis, so how do we think about the economic impact of reforms? Here we follow closely what has been done in the economic literature. Luckily, there has been quite a bit of progress, especially over the last 20 years or so, in gathering together information about the extent of structural reforms across countries, and there have been also innovation about econometric techniques that can give us a measure for the impact of reforms on the economy. Essentially, here the procedure goes into a few different steps. First of all, we want to have an econometric estimate of the impact of improving along some structural reform indicator on productivity. And then we also want to combine that with an assessment of what are the structural reform gaps in a given country. How far is Brazil lagging behind, for example, in our analysis, relative to the average level of structural reforms in other advanced economies. So how much gains can we seize by moving along the structural reforms line, essentially. Now, if you combine the estimated impact of reform with how much is the gaps that Brazil is confronting at this time, you can find a total assessment on what could be the impact on productivity if Brazil were to engage in structural reforms across different sectors in the economy. And what we find in our work is the following picture that gives us an indication of how different structural reforms will produce in terms of benefiting raising TFP growth in the country. Now, as you can see, the most impactful reform that Brazil can undertake at the current juncture, according to our estimates, is actually reforms to the banking sector. As you may know, Brazil has a very large level of state intervention in credit allocation through different programs of subsidized credits. There's a very heavy work in the economy and credit allocation by public banks. And our indicators suggest that if Brazil were to scale down the extent of state intervention in credit markets, productivity could really increase quite significantly. Besides banking sector reforms, there's also quite a bit of gains to be seized, for example, from labor market reforms, even though these estimates do not yet take into account the labor market reform that was implemented last year. And this is why in our report we are advocating to take some time to assess the effect of labor reforms from last year before proceeding further along this dimension. Reforms to the legal system, product market, and trade openness will also be quite powerful in increasing TFP growth, but to a lesser extent the banking sector reform. Therefore, from the economic lenses, our advice would be to push ahead with banking sector reform. Now, what about the second step of the analysis? What about the extent of support for reforms? Now, this is a much more novel aspect of our analysis, something that much fewer people have really thought about and done. And so we need to use a little bit of creativity to make some progress on this direction. So how can we get an assessment of which kind of reforms people in Brazil will be most favorable of? What we're doing in our work is to look at some survey data from Latin Barometer, which collects information about people's views across Latin America and over time. And we identify a few questions that can be quite helpful in guiding our analysis in thinking about what are the reforms which are politically more palatable in Brazil. In particular, there is a very interesting question that asks for people's support about a free market economy. Are you in favor or not of free market principles in the economy? And we take this question as a question which really pertains to whether people will be in favor of structural reforms which aim to make the economy working more in line with free market forces. Now, what we find when we look at this question, it's a very interesting finding, which is the support for a free market economy and therefore support for structural reforms tend to be stronger when economic growth is solid. This is quite interesting and paradoxical because very often policymakers try to postpone the process of structural reforms until the economy is finally confronting a severe recession, which is when the pressure is so strong on policymakers to do something to raise economic growth. Now, that is exactly the worst possible time to implement structural reforms from the political economy perspective, because at the time of a recession is indeed when people are the least in favor of reforming their economies. And this is quite understandable, because even though these reforms can over time produce gains for everybody in the society, over the short run, they can entail some reallocation costs. Some people may have to move across different professions. Some firms may have to move to different segments of their product market. And that becomes costly to do when the economy is already confronting a recession. It is much easier, and people therefore are much more in favor of those kind of reforms when the economy is growing at a healthy pace. Therefore, the message from this first layer of analysis is be very proactive as a policymaker. Do reforms when economic growth is sound. Don't postpone reforms until a crisis strikes. Now, a second very interesting question that we can do work with from Latin Barometer is a question that asks people about what is the most important factor for the economic development in your country. Now, some of these answers can be mapped into structural reforms very easily. For example, sometimes people answer to this question saying the most important issue for economic development of Brazil is more integration with the world. And that can be clearly taken as a sign of appetite for reforms that will open up Brazil, for example, to more international trade. Similarly, sometimes people say that they want a stronger rule of law, and they want higher quality of institutions, of public institutions. And this also can be taken as a measure of people's support for legal reforms that eventually will provide greater protection to people and their properties in Brazil. Now, other answers are somewhat more difficult to map into structural reforms, but I hope I'll convince you that we can also make some progress along that line. For example, sometimes people say that the most important factor is more productivity and innovation in the Brazilian economy. And we're going to take that as an indicator for appetite for reforms to the banking sector and the product market, which aim indeed specifically to raise productivity and innovation in a given economy. Also, sometimes people say they want more equity of opportunity to increase economic growth in Brazil. And we're going to take that as a measure of support for labor market reforms that aim to break barriers across profession and allow people to relocate themselves into whichever profession they feel more productive. Now, to give you some comfort about the soundness of our matching procedure of using this answer as a signal for appetite for structural reforms, we can do a couple of exercises. We can first of all look at aggregate data across countries and ask, is it true that in countries where people ask in a disproportionately larger manner for more innovation and productivity, is it true that those countries are the ones that lag behind the most in banking sector and product market reforms? And the answer is quite strongly yes, that is indeed the case. People that call for innovation and productivity tend to live in economic systems in countries that lag behind in product market and banking sector reforms, therefore giving us a first sort of validation of our mapping. A second thing that we can do is to exploit the micro-level information of the questionnaire, the survey data, because very helpfully, the survey asks not only for people's views about a few different issues, but also collects information about their own personal characteristics. And very luckily for us, they collect information about the employment status. Are you employed, self-employed, and so on and so forth. Now, what we find is that when you look at who are those people that call for more equity of opportunity, well, those tend to be indeed the people that would benefit from labor market reforms the most. Those are the people that are either unemployed or self-employed, which are indeed those categories that are better placed to benefit from a greater liberalization of the labor market, a reduction in barriers to entry, therefore giving us a second layer of validation to our approach. Now, if we follow our mapping procedure, therefore, this is what we find in terms of public support for reforms in Brazil. As you can see, the greater support will be for product market and banking sector reform because people really disproportionately want more innovation and productivity to lift economic growth in Brazil. There's also quite a bit of appetite for legal reforms. You know, the issue of corruption and weak institutions being clearly very important in Brazil over the last few years, and people do have appetite for progress along the dimension. Somewhat less popular are measures that will open up the economy to more trade, and even less so measures that will further liberalize the labor market. Now, if we place the two steps of our analysis, the economic impact of reforms, as well as the amount of political support, we can thus lay out the structural reforms on this simple diagram that places on the vertical axis the extent of public support, and on the horizontal axis the economic impact in terms of ability of lifting TFP growth in the economy. Now, as you can see, banking sector reforms are the very top right corner of this diagram, which is the kind of reforms we're looking for. These are reforms that will deliver quite a bit of economic gains and will also gather quite a bit of public support. Therefore, at current juncture, our advice to the Brazilian authorities will be to put emphasis on the structural reform agenda, especially in the banking sector. Now, looking beyond the banking sector, you start seeing some trade-off between some reforms, like product market reforms, which are politically quite palatable, but economically somewhat weaker in terms of lifting potential growth in the economy, while labor market reforms will be on the opposite path of this trade-off, quite a bit of economic impact, but much lower level of public support. And here the governments will essentially need to walk these trade-offs, and one way in which you can do this is to think about your political strength as a new government. If you feel confident about your ability to push ahead with reforms, you may want to lean towards economic reforms which are economically more impactful. Maybe an older government that has been in power for longer and has somewhat less political backing may at that point lean more towards reforms which are politically easier to pass. Now, as I told you at the beginning, we also have some considerations which I think should be given to the issue of legislative framework of reforms and fiscal impact of reforms. Why is this so? Well, because first of all, thinking about the legislative process, you're going to see that some reforms like trade openness and banking sector reforms in Brazil are possible to be legislated by the government without necessarily going through approval by the Congress, therefore are facing a much easier legislative process. Other reforms, for example, product market and especially labor market reforms, are much more difficult from a legislative standpoint because they will require congressional approval, sometimes even through lengthy and difficult constitutional amendments. Therefore, the legislative dimension is another point of view through which you can internalize the political economy aspects of reforms, once again leaning in favor of banking sector reforms. For what concerns the fiscal angle, let me just say that in general, within the structural reforms, they tend to deliver positive fiscal gains to the government because by lifting economic growth, they also tend to improve fiscal accounts. But this process can take some time because over the very short run, some reforms may actually entail some fiscal cost. What I have in mind is, in particular, labor market reforms. Sometimes they create an increase in unemployment of the short run that requires some public expenditure in terms of unemployment insurance or in terms of active labor market policies as public authorities try to ease the relocation process of people into new jobs. Now, for banking sector reforms, the scale looks positive even through the fiscal lenses because by removing state distortion, by removing credit subsidies, these kind of reforms can even deliver some positive fiscal gains even in the short run. Again, an additional reason for why banking sector reform could be the right reforms to move on at the current time. Now, in conclusion, we really hope you'll find interesting our approach that tries to combine not only an economic assessment of reforms, but also with a second layer of analysis about the political support for reforms. The goal being give priorities to those reforms that have the highest economic gains at the lower political cost. And Brazil, at current juncture, should therefore, according to this analysis, take a very close look at banking sector reforms. An additional insights that came out of the presentation, just want to reemphasize here, is that political support for reforms is higher when economic growth is ongoing, as nowadays in Brazil. Therefore, we think this is really an excellent time to press ahead with reforms. Don't delay undertaking reforms once the crisis strikes, because political support will be much weaker then. Thank you all so much, and I leave the podium to Isa.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try to give you a non-technical summary of this research project. But first, when I first started working on Brazil, and that was some 5 years ago, I took a look at the Brazilian wage bill, and I thought, first thing is we have to look at this more closely because it seems to be very high. But suddenly my ambitions were overtaken by other research priorities. because there are so many things going on in Brazil. And just over the past 5 years, if you can remember, even prior to the deep recession we had, there was a period of high inflation, we had a very high Selic, low investment. Damiano talked about it, so we looked at infrastructure quality. There were numerous credit distortions in the economy, and the exchange rate management was fiscally very costly. So we looked into all of these things, and of course, the elephant in the room, the pension reform. And finally, the time has come to talk about the wage bill, but this is the right time to talk about the wage bill, actually. And the reason is that Brazil has an expenditure ceiling now, which is in place for the federal government only. And we have shown through our work on pension reform that this reform can bring about some savings, more savings in the longer run. And that's the right way to go. The pension reform is supposed to address long-term fiscal sustainability pressures and not short-term liquidity needs. So we will need to have some contraction in other areas of expenditure. And the second largest expenditure item is the wage bill. You can say this is relevant at central government level only because the cap is at federal government level. However, this issue is very important for the states as well. States have their own fiscal responsibility rules, and a number of them have had a very difficult time complying with those rules. So I'm going to show you just a few figures so that you can have an idea what the wage bill means for Brazil and what it means comparatively with other countries. We don't really like to do cross-country comparisons of the wage bill because these are typically marred by differences in coverage of administrative units, but also the type of the wages that they're including in that. So this is a bit of a stretch exercise. Here we are showing that the estimated wage bill in Brazil is 13% of GDP. It is higher than the Latin American average and is higher even than advanced economy average. Now, I must say this is the very broad definition of the wage bill that Brazil uses because it includes all the government units, so states and municipalities. It includes also social security contributions paid by the employers. And it includes also the social security contributions that are needed to cover the pension system's actuarial deficits. So this is a very wide contribution. 3% of GDP are only the social security contributions. It is important to understand that because part of the size of the wage bill can only tackled through a pension reform, that 3% of GDP. Otherwise, Brazil spends nearly 45% of revenues on the wages, and 34% of primary spending, so total spending less interest, goes to pay salaries of public sector servants. Some 2/3 of the wage bill are expenditure takes place at the subnational level, and 85% of the employment in the public sector are at subnational level. This is very common for decentralized countries. Typically, employees who work in the education sector and in the health sector and in military, they are typically police, less military, so are employed at subnational level. So just to give you a sense at what does that mean, how does the wage bill compete with other expenditure? So I think Antonio or Damiano already has said something similar to this. Brazil spends very little on investment. Brazil invests public investment. Public investment is only 2% of GDP. That means that the wage bill is 6 times larger than investment spending. And this is just a figure that shows you where other countries in Latin America are placed across those two dimensions. So some other issues are that we are looking into in this research are the substantial disparities in pays across the various levels of government. So you can see in these figures that the federal government employees are paid much more than employees in the rest of the public sector. Well, you can argue yes, but they are also typically more educated. Well, this is correct, but even controlling for education level and experience, federal government employees' wages are higher than in the rest of the public sector. The next figure shows the wage bill in the states. And what we are trying to do here is to relate it to the state's own GDP. And what you can see in this figure that the largest share of public employment is in the poorest states, those of the north and northeast, and they are also the smallest states. So when you show it in percent of their own GDP, you see that the poorer states spend relatively more on wages than richer and larger states. So for instance, in Sao Paulo, wage bill is less than 5% of own GDP, while in a poor state like Roraima, it's over 20% of GDP. It is important to acknowledge this because some of the decisions that are taken outside of the scope of the state, so for instance, the recent decision to increase the wages in the judiciary by 16% just a couple of weeks ago, this decision is a benchmark for the public sector, and those wage increases trickle down through all levels of governments to the states, to the subnationals, and they weigh more heavily on the poor states. And they cannot do anything about it. So just to summarize, so the wage bill is high relative to peers. It weighs heavily on resources, in particular on subnational resources. It competes with productive spending. It has been increasing over time. It's increasing more in the states. It has been increasing in real terms at the federal government as well, but not as a share of GDP. And what lies behind that? Typically, there are other two possibilities. Either the government is hiring more people, or it's increasing the wages. And when we look at in comparative terms, Brazil's public sector labor force is not particularly large comparatively. We also have to understand that this is a decentralized country, so it's kind of very common to see a larger public sector employment. So that leads us to think it's really the wage levels that are problematic in Brazil. And the figure to the right shows you what does it mean to have a high public sector wage compared to the private sector wage. These data are borrowed from different studies, but the one for Brazil we estimated in our previous work, and we showed that the wage premium for public sector workers against the private sector is around 30%. This is the average wage premium. It varies a lot across different skill levels. So at lower levels of skills, this premium can go up to 50%. That means that, for instance, a driver in the public sector has a wage that is 50% more than a driver in the private sector. These differences tend to compress over education and skills, and at the higher level of education, they become very small. So what does this mean for income inequality also is that basically public sector workers are among the richest people in the country. According to their income, and I'm talking only about income from wages, they fall in the 70% of them fall in the top quintile of the income distribution, whereas private sector workers are only in the 17%. The inequality you're observing between, so the reason why we are talking about that inequality is because an adjustment and lowering the wages in the public sector would also be equitable from the country perspective. This is a picture which shows that the inequality in pay is pronounced even within the public sector and even within the federal government. This picture shows what are the differences in wage level for the same professions across different ministries. So this shows you that, for instance, a clerk that employed in the energy Ministry of Energy can have a wage that is 30% or 40% higher than a clerk elsewhere in the federal government. Okay. The reason for these stark differences in pays across ministries is that Brazil public sector is characterized by a very large number of career streams and wage grades. So within the federal government, you have more than 130 different career streams, sometimes overlapping. So the problem with that is not only the complexity and the wage inequality, it's also a difficulty this creates for reallocating workers, employees across the public sector. So to the extent that you want to have some kind of retrenchment and consolidation in the public sector, you have to be able to do it in an organized way and reutilize some of these resources across ministries. But it is impossible to do it because people fall under separate careers and wage grids and they cannot be moved. So what are some of the reform options? In our research, we do some simulations and we show how a retrenchment and real decline in wages and a freeze in hiring can contribute over time to some savings. And we calculated approximately we need about 1 percentage point in GDP in savings in order to meet the expenditure cap only at the federal government level. And how to achieve these savings in practice? It's not easy. It is not easy because public wage bill is inertial. It grows with seniority. Even if you do not increase the wages, the wage bill grows because people get continuously promoted. Another problem we have also that the Constitution does not allow the wages to be cut in nominal terms. So it's very difficult to achieve a real decrease in salaries. And it's also very difficult to fire people in Brazil. So we do some simulation where we show how we can achieve this saving by through attrition. And some of the additional ideas we have are also summarized in the next two slides. There is a possibility, for instance, to look into the to have a multi-year agreement with employees to maintain these wage increases in wage level below inflation. This is one possibility. There is a possibility also to review what is called allowances, which are not the base wage, and there are very many in Brazil, and they have been they've come under a lot of criticism in recent years. Also, there is a need to slow down the progression rules and try to introduce more performance-based increases in the wages. And over the longer term, what we could think of is to completely abandon the seniority increases and to fold the allowances into the base wage. This is something that we typically recommend all countries because it brings up about also more transparency in the way wages are awarded. And definitely the first area and most important is the one of the wage grid that have to be consolidated into fewer that can be maybe typical for certain type of professions. But another area that is important is to think about the wage bill in terms of through a also optic of the demographics. And this is important in particular at the subnational level. For instance, one area that we have not looked at into, but the World Bank has, is education, where the pupil-teachers ratios are very low. And we know that over time, as the population ages, there will be fewer students and even more teachers. So maybe this is an area where some savings could be achieved in the wage bill at subnational level, and could also create some space for increasing, for instance, spending on health, where the demand is going to be higher over the long term. Okay. So this is
When you talk about banking sector reform, could you be more specific what you're talking about? What is it? What are the measures that would, we are talking here of privatization of state-owned banks, and on the careers, actually, what Isa mentions, 130 in the federal, right?
Just the federal.
Yeah, it's about 400 if you consider states also. So there are 400 careers in the public sector in Brazil. No wonder why that mothers in Brazil want their children to do the concurso. Concurso is what young people live for. Instead of looking for jobs in the private sector, they go for concurso, and they prepare for these, and they prepare for whatever concurso is there. It's not that they have a vocation to this and to that. They have a vocation to concurso.
We work for the public sector.
Because that pay, yes, that gives you job stability, pays much better than the private sector. And as a grandniece of mine said, and then, when I can retire at 52 and she is 24 or 25 and thinking about retirement. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the depth of this problem. But could you give us on the financial sector, we are talking about what? Privatizing? We are talking about reducing their capacity. What is this?
Can I use this microphone, or does it work? Yeah. Okay. Very good. So let me say that essentially what we do in our work is to look at indicators which are based on a measure of the extent of public banks in the credit market. And that is what is really correlating negatively with economic growth. So you find that countries that have a very large presence of public banks in providing credit that tend to have lower productivity in their economies. I think, though, this has to be taken a little bit more broadly in terms of all kind of interventions whereby you have a public sector that try to redirect credit, very often at subsidized rates, which start distorting the allocation towards some preferred borrowers in the economy. It's quite natural to believe that even though there could be some, positive externalities that policymakers are trying to go after, the empirical analysis also shows us that they tend to be distortions associated with that. Now, the exact menu of interventions is quite broad in the case of Brazil. There are many ways through which the government is intervening. There is a disproportionate share of public banks in Brazil, even though the latest government is trying to already unwind quite a bit of the presence, for example, of BNDES in credit markets. But there's also a much broader range of credit programs that the state and the government is essentially to administrative, even through private banks, not only necessarily through public banks. So there's really a broad range of options that can be taken on here. And again, the idea is just to make sure that the allocation of credit is done through more productive targets by letting banks choose a bit more by themselves, which are the borrowers which really deserve credit, which are the borrowers that really have the best investment opportunities in the country. To move back from the levels of credit state intervention, at the peak of the crisis, we've seen, for example, that the amount of credit that was distorting, intermediating through these schemes reached 50% of the total credit allocation in the country. So it's an extremely high level of intervention that is very unusual in emerging markets, and there are many ways of starting to sort of unwind that a bit more.
Okay, Peter Bogart, ex-World Bank. Isn't it that's much more important that you still have one of the highest real interest rates continuing for those who are not having access to the development banks where they get subsidized? I mean, unless you can really settle that, I don't think there is any chance to get that sector moving.
Yeah, so it's a good point that the real interest rate in Brazil has been historically very high. There are two considerations. One is that there has been quite a bit of progress in lowering the real rate over the last few years. And most of that is actually to the credit of the central bank operations that have really brought the interest rate down, the level of inflation much more anchored. So some of that excess, interest rate is already come down over the last few years. There's clearly much more to be done. Antonio had a chart showing the net interest margins of the banks. So there's quite a bit of pricing that banks are able to exercise in Brazil, and there's an ongoing debate of what are the drivers of that. In our own work, we do think that some of these state intervention measures that essentially force banks to provide some subsidized credit to pockets of the market, they can also essentially lead banks to charge higher interest rates on what we refer to as the free market credit part of the industry. So by unwinding some of the state distortion in credit markets, we think also it will be likely to witness a decline in interest rate provided to free borrowers in the economy.
But also the TGLP has been linked to the market rate, no? So the subsidized rate for long-term financing. Exactly.
There are three points in the financial sectors, three components of inefficiency, so to speak. One is, as we were discussing before, the big role of the public sector and the highly distortion, not only of public banks, but also of all the subsidies, which is good. The second component is the high operation cost. So the legal system has problems. So and this has implication for NPLs. It's difficult to obtain back your money if you are a bank, and all the costs that enter into the bank. So it's not the banking sector, unfortunately, is working in efficient system, and so it's reflecting this in high interest margin. And the third is the market structure, which is highly concentrated, and in some banks are virtually very strong market power in their segment. And this is something which is also important. So there are three different components which interrelate: the role of the public sector, the inefficiency of high operational cost, and market structure. The three things together cause an inefficient system. And our FSAP also has gone with a very specific recommendation on how to tackle some regulatory issues. I don't go into detail because they are pretty technical, but you can find in the public document.
Just 3 points. You mentioned the salary increase for Supreme Court judges. Now, that's been approved by what we call a lame duck Congress, which has been approving several fiscal bombs for the new government. However, the current outgoing president, who is also a very lame duck, can veto that. The Congress approved the increase for the judges, but the current president could veto that. The other point is that several times we receive. My name is David Fleischer, University of Brasilia. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. We receive visitors from Europe and from the United States, and they say, "Well, what's your inflation rate running?" I say, "Well, maybe 4 or 5%." "Well, if you go to the bank, what are you going to charge? What are you going to be charged as an interest rate?" And I said, "Well, maybe 8 or 9% per month." And the people say, "Well, that's a crime." I said, "Well, in Brazil, that's not a crime. That's how private banks operate in Brazil." The third point is you mentioned our development bank, BNDES, which has always been a very closed black box. Apparently, the new president and his new economy minister are going to open this black box of the development bank, and we'll see exactly what's been happening in this bank over the last 10, 20, 30 years.
Hi, my name is Marjorie Macir. I'm an independent consultant. I'm curious, Isa, if you could talk about the two last slides that you had about the changes that you suggest. Between those, are there some that you would prioritize, or historically in other countries, what has been more successful?
What we have recommended to countries in the past, typically when we are in a position to make recommendations on these issues as a fund, it is during the crisis when governments are found to have to jump in quickly, find some savings, and then in the short term, what they could do is freeze employment, freeze hiring, and freeze wages. However, this is something that can be done over a couple of years, and then typically pressures reemerge, and it is not an organized way of dealing with the wage bill. So it depends what kind of time frame do you have in mind. So these are some of the measures that can be undertaken in the short run. But I think the one of the wage grid is probably more complex, but it's the most urgent measure that has to be implemented. Because if you want to implement, for instance, a hiring freeze in which you are not replacing people who are retiring, or you're replacing every second person who is retiring, you can end up having offices that need to exist but have no employees. So you need to be able to reallocate people. And if you cannot do it because of these, legal impossibilities, then you cannot achieve any save. You can simply, it is just not going to work. So I think this is the first area that needs to be tackled. And then the second, I would say, this area where we have an inertial increase in the wage bill through the promotions. We think that rewarding performance is a better way of increasing wages, but also it gives you the possibility to control the wage bill growth in a period of pressure like this one. That you're not just found in front of a situation that is out of control.
Yes, Marcelo Verburg, Inter-American Development Bank. You just had three excellent expositions about Brazil, but I miss an issue that I believe is the most important in Brazil, now and ever, was the issue about the social income distribution.
Mm-hmm.
I know that is the fiscal sector, the banking sector, any kind of reform that Brazil need is essential to grow again. But the number one priority to grow, in my opinion, is to have a policy, not a socialist policy, a capitalist policy, to have a best income distribution in Brazil. And I believe that if this not happen, we will not achieve a huge economic growth, never. And I would like to know if you agree with me.
Thank you for raising this important question. We have done some work of that, but there is just limited time to present all the research we have done. And actually, the presentation that I have made on wage bill is closely connected to your question. We have seen that inequality has declined in Brazil over the past decade or so, maybe not during the last 2 years of where we had a severe contraction. Well, there are different ways, measures of inequality also, and shortcomings in the data. I see you're not very convinced, that's why I'm saying that. But we have seen that the inequality has declined as a result of the social programs, but no, I'm talking between 2010, 2004 and 2014, let's say. And so we have seen a decline in the inequality, and we think it was mostly due to an increase in schooling and also some social programs like Bolsa Familia. But we have also seen that the growth of wages in the public sector has acted against that. So that has contributed to let's say, that has compressed the gains from the decrease in inequality that have occurred over that decade. So this is also one of the reasons why we're advocating in favor of a consolidation of the wage bill, not only through employment, but also through the wage levels.
Okay, well, with that, I would like to thank Damiano, Isa, and Antonio very much for their presentation, for being with us. A round of applause. We will just invite the next panel up, and coffee is there. We'll just have 5 minutes break, and we'll be back on time. Okay, starting at 10:30. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to carry on now with the next stage of this morning's session, which is the book launch of the book, which you can see right here.
Please take your seats.
Which is the Oxford Handbook of the Brazilian Economy. And like in the case of a session, we'd like to dedicate this launch to our late friend and colleague, Professor Werner Baer, who played a very important part in the early stages of this volume's preparation. Now, why did we put this book together? Well, it seems there were a number of needs. The first need was a volume that would cover multiple aspects of Brazil's economic reality, do so in an academically rigorous manner, but in an accessible manner, and deal with Brazil's fundamental structural challenges, trying to understand what's driving the economy, what's holding it back, and in terms of policy, what might need to be done in the future. So this all got going in 2015 while Werner was still with us. Werner passed in March of 2016, and then it fell to my colleague Carlos Arzoni and I to pick up the baton and keep it going, which we did, but in the tradition of Cecil B. DeMille, with a cast of thousands. And you can see this, which looks like a mosaic or something. In fact, it's the logos of the institutions of all the colleagues who participated in this volume. And you can see they're from all over the place. Europe, here in the United States, but of course most of all in Brazil. I just want to walk you through the chapter structure a bit. There were handouts which show this. You'll cut out and take home copies if you want to see what's in the book. But we begin with a broad introduction, and then we get into a section dealing with the historical development of Brazil's economy, the kind of mini economic history, as it were, to place everything in context. We then look at macroeconomic policy and institutions, the banking system, which came up, of course, in the discussion just now, the development bank, which came up, of course, in discussion just now. Then we go on to look at the productive sectors, manufacturing, industry, but also agriculture. And we give that a really detailed treatment. I mean, the focus of this book is very much on the supply side, which was an area where Werner Baer had a particular interest. Werner Baer was one of these people who believed that looking at an economy is like trying to fix a car. You need to lift the hood and then get your hands dirty and get out all the little bits and try to put it back together again. So it was in that spirit that this book is unashamedly about detail, sector, and a lot of content there. We then have something on Brazil's regions, which Carlos will talk about a little bit later on, this specialized area. And then a lot on the socioeconomic dimensions, on Bolsa Familia, income distribution, poverty, and so on. We then have a section that deals with Brazil and the world economy. How does Brazil integrate with the global whole? Trade reform, investment reform, competitiveness, all of these kinds of issues are covered in some detail and in quite a disaggregated way. And then we go on to look at the changing role of the state. And we round off, significantly enough, with a chapter on corruption, which was a late addition to the book. Okay? Obviously, when we started preparing this book, the world looked slightly different to the way the world looks now. So we wanted to appear very sagacious, as if we'd completely internalized all of this at the very outset. So we included a chapter on corruption, multi-agency approaches to corruption, and the economic impacts. So what are the objectives of this book? Well, they can be summarized threefold. Firstly, to provide an understanding of the economy's evolution over time. I'm just going to get a little bit more excitable now. And the connection, the current characteristics to this. Second, to portray and explain Brazil's broader place in the global economy and consider the ways in which this role has changed and is likely to change over coming years. And third, to provide an understanding not only of how one of the world's key economies has developed and transformed itself, but also of the ways in which this process has yet to be completed. So in other words, it's the unmet challenges, the gaps. Why is Brazil performing the way it is? Why is Brazil underperforming? So I think this tallies very well with the presentations we've had this morning. We are preoccupied with the same questions, and indeed look at some of the very same sectors and issues that our colleagues from the IMF are looking at. So let's begin by characterizing the long-run evolution of Brazil's economy, at the risk of some overlap with this morning, so I'm not going to go into it in laborious detail, other than just to kick things off, looking at the cover there, which I think was one of the things we had to debate over, which was the right colour scheme for this, but that's Botafogo, by the way. Okay. So how does Brazil begin? Well, colonial beginnings marked by mercantilism, slavery and commodity production. We then talk about the great structural transformations which have happened, the industrialization process of the mid-20th century, but the sense in which, despite the structural transformations, despite the very real reforms of the last 20 and 30 years, Brazil remains beset by serious problems. And part of that is to do with economic growth, low economic growth and very volatile economic growth. And that was discussed a little bit this morning. And the structural impediments that prevent Brazil from embarking on a path of accelerated, socially inclusive and sustained growth. Also, very high inequality and periods of price instability and external disequilibrium have continued to mark Brazil's economic evolution over the decades. We also have a very strong role for the state in the economy. And I think what comes through time and time again is that the difference between success and failure can be your proximity to the state. Whereas whether as a borrower or somebody about to take the concurso, it's all the same thing. And this has really marked Brazil's development, and one can contrast that to some extent with what one can observe in East Asia, for example. Also, on the positive side, we've seen the build-up of tremendous technological capabilities in certain sectors, notably agriculture, which Gerardo will be talking about later on, but also in aerospace and information technology. So some great positives, some areas of global excellence, islands of excellence, but perhaps something more of a morass of mediocrity surrounding it. So the challenge is really to broaden out that excellence, become more competitive in a number of different fields, give growth a broader base. And one of the great features of Brazil is, of course, regional inequality. It's not just personal income inequality, it's regional inequality. This map illustrates the point in quite a pithy way, and it's taken from Carlos Arzoni's chapter. And of course, I will leave Carlos to discuss that in a few moments. Progress was, of course, significantly made on poverty and interpersonal inequality, as we can see here, which traces the evolution of a situation from 1992 through to 2014. But we know that subsequent to 2014, these trends have reversed themselves. And it seems one of the challenges for the new administration is to try to resume progress here. And the big question is, to what extent are they willing or able to do that? Okay. In terms of changing the place in the global economy, the interesting point is that over the past few years, Brazil has increasingly moved towards being a commodity-based export economy. So whereas it had quite a diversified export base, or moving towards that at least in the 1960s and 1970s, there's been a reversion towards concentration on minerals exports, agricultural exports, and so on and so forth. So that's one feature. But the other feature, which you might be able to observe from this chart, is that Brazil is actually not very export intensive compared with other economies or comparable economies. And if we're trying to understand what is retarding growth in Brazil, perhaps a good place to begin looking is the relatively closed nature of Brazil's economy. So if we sum exports and imports and divide GDP, we find that Brazil, by global standards, remains quite a closed place. And the question is whether the new administration, which appears more wedded to the idea of trade openness, whether it will be able to move the needle on this really important metric. So, of course, there are a number of unaddressed challenges. Broadening competitive strength, I've already mentioned. But another one, harking back to the presentations this morning, is to boost productivity growth. And it's here that we see another red light flashing in the cockpit. And we can see the extent to which Brazil's productivity growth has been, which is this dark, well, it's black line here, has been somewhat anemic compared with other comparable economies. For example, this dotted line here, which we can see arcing away into the stratosphere, that's South Korea, okay? This line here is India, okay? So the point I'm trying to make, which that chart tries to make it as best it can in monochrome, which is what all the publishers allowed us, is that Brazil remains to some extent constrained by a productivity growth issue. And the question is, well, how can we raise rates of productivity growth? And quite obviously, one important place to start is education, which is a key challenge. And one of our chapters by Claudio Moro Castro looks at that very thing, looks at metrics of educational attainment, considers the progress, the real progress which has been made by Brazil in raising educational attainment, but points out that according to the PISA rankings, Brazil still has an awful long way to go. And of course, it's one thing to secure excellence in formal education or PISA rankings, but translating that into productivity, translating that into innovation has always been the big challenge. Leading the horse of education, innovation, and human capital to the water of innovation and productivity growth. This is, of course, a central feature in the innovation studies literature. But Brazil is going to have to tackle that very clearly. And another key issue it's going to have to tackle, and I think this was referred to this morning, and I know that the IMF have done some work on this. I remember coming across a paper, is on infrastructure. And Brazil lags well behind its international counterparts in terms of investment in infrastructure, but also in terms of the quality of infrastructure which exists. And this is something which holds back exports. This is something which holds back productivity. This is something which constrains the diversification of the economy. And the question is, well, how are we going to unlock infrastructure? Will reform of the National Development Bank help here? Will reform of the banking system help here? Will regulatory reform help here? And these are the sorts of debates which have been going on for some while now, and perhaps we have the real chance of being able to do something concrete across these dimensions, and maybe that's somewhere the questions could follow afterwards. Let's see. But in doing a lot of these things, of course, we're going to require some fiscal space, some fiscal room for maneuver. And that's what we don't really have for reasons that were made quite clear this morning. Brazil remains fiscally very, very constrained. And in order to open up that space, that's why we need pension reform, okay? That's why also we need interest rates to continue to fall so that space is opened up for discretionary spending. It's extremely important. And another key thing which is going to have to be addressed, of course, is the state-business relationship. In particular, the need to overcome corruption and to reduce, as it were, transactions costs in the economy, to increase transparency and accountability in a way that doesn't just satisfy ethical concerns that we may have, but directly contributes to the efficiency of economic activity. It's extremely important, and chapter 35, our very last chapter, deals with that enormous issue. And I think it's presumably an interesting signal that the former prosecutor in Lava Jato, Sergio Moro, has been appointed justice minister by the new administration. So what does that signal? Well, one argument is it signals a renewed commitment to pushing ahead against corruption. Others would take a different view. Again, maybe we can have a debate about that later on. So I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Geraldo Martha, who's going to talk about one of the sectors that we look at in this book, which is the agricultural sector. He will be followed by Carlos Azzoni, who will talk about the regional dimension of Brazil's economic development, and then I will finally wrap things up with hopefully a few hopeful remarks. So I'm going to hand over to Geraldo.
Thank you, Matt. Okay. Thank you very much. Paulo, thank you so very much for hosting this launch here. Also would like to thank Professor Werner Baer, Ed, and Azzoni for this really kind invitation. And this is the problem of agriculture in Brazil. I'm not sure if all of you are aware, but the biggest challenges Brazil faced over the past decades was to transform Brazilian agriculture from a traditional agriculture to one very strongly based on science. Up to the 60s, Brazil received food donations from abroad, for example. USAID provided food donations to Brazil, and in the space of only one generation, Brazil is second only to the US in terms of agricultural exports. And the secret behind such an amazing transformation was the science-based agriculture in which Embrapa, the research arm of the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, played a very important role, together with the state research organizations in Brazil and the colleges of agriculture in Brazil. But talking about Embrapa and its role a little bit in this modernization of Brazilian agriculture, Embrapa was established in 1973 as the research arm of the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, and the focus was to search for science-based solutions to deal with the problems in agriculture. And that was essential because the problems in agriculture, they are quite dynamic. So we need to have a very strong research system to continuously provide, new solutions to the problems that are appearing. Embrapa is a public corporation, but is not is not in the sense of the public in Brazil. For example, we discussed a lot the differences between public and private sector in Brazil. Since its very beginning, Embrapa, for example, follows the private sector rules in terms of employees. We are under the CLT in Brazil and under the federal workers' rule. So this makes some differences. A very focused research approach. The critical mass in Brazil was very limited back in the 70s, so we need to put people together where we can have, a greater impact. Because of this, Embrapa chose to have three sorts of research centers. Product centers, such as soybean center, beef cattle center, dairy cattle centers, and so forth and so on. Eco-regional centers, such as the Center for the Cerrado, that made this huge transformation in Brazilian agriculture, but also the centers in the Amazon and in the subtropical regions of Brazil. And also thematic centers, such as the Center for Informatics in Agriculture, the Center for Environment, and so forth and so on. Embrapa has 42 research units, and in 2016, we had almost 10,000 employees. From that, we have 2,400 scientists, and this comes a very interesting thing to mention to you. Another very strong thing about Embrapa was this strong emphasis in building a strong human resources. So for you to have an idea, when Embrapa started, it had a little bit more than 800 scientists in 73, 74. In its first phase up to 1990, the number of researchers increased more than 5% per year. And by 1990, Embrapa had a little bit more than 2,000 researchers, pretty close to the same number we have today. And then after that phase, after this increase in the number of researchers, Embrapa invested heavily in terms of, a higher capacity for that human resource. So in the 70s, Embrapa had basically less than 5% in terms of PhD researchers. And today we have more than 90% of PhD researchers. So these make the difference. Another thing, since the very beginning, Embrapa understood that international cooperation is key. So in the first 12, 13 years of Embrapa, from 1973 up to 1985, Embrapa sent abroad more than 1,000 young researchers to be trained. Most of them, actually like 85%, more or less, came here to the US to be trained, to learn how to do the things, to get, a sense of what good research is, how we can organize the things we are doing with. And then another thing, since the very beginning, Embrapa paid a lot of attention in terms of its return to society. And over the past 20 years, for each dollar Brazilian society invested into Embrapa, Embrapa has returned $11 to Brazilian society. So, a kind of summarizing this situation, Embrapa is central to the agricultural research system in Brazil, but also we have the important influence of state research organizations and agricultural colleges. But I would like to emphasize this point here. In the 80s, Brazilian agriculture was already investing 1.2% of the agricultural GDP. That same level is the level the Brazilian economy as a whole is investing today. And over the past 25 years, Brazilian agriculture has been investing close to 2% of the agricultural GDP in terms of research, and this has been making a lot of difference. For example, in terms of productivity, a few examples. Over the past decades, cotton has increased its yields by 11 times. Beef cattle by more than 6 times. Corn by more than 4, soybean by more than 4, and that is the big transformation in Brazilian agriculture, a strong focus in terms of productivity gains. And it was mentioned this morning that not only, of course, a partial productivity of land is important, it's important to consider the total factor productivity. And for you to have an idea, in the 60s, the total factor productivity in Brazilian agriculture was 0.17%. Over the past 15 years, it's 3.15%. No major agriculture in the world has a higher rate of growth in terms of total factor productivity than Brazilian agriculture. More important, because of this huge productivity growth, a huge land-saving effect was generated. And this large country that is Brazil still has 2/3 of the country covered with native vegetation. It's also nice to highlight that more than 20% of Brazil is preserved with native vegetation in properties, in farms, and the farmers are actually not receiving anything to do that. They are just preserving that land for society. But also in terms of the social dimension, look, this is inflation discounted food prices. There was this huge drop in food prices to consumers. This was especially important back in the 70s and the 80s because of the big inflation. Plus, at that time, more than 40% of the family's budget was spent with food. So this rapidly decrease in food prices allowed for a very effective income effect, especially to the poor. And today, Brazilian society is paying close to 50% of the value they paid for food in the 70s. At last but not least, what was the cost of such a transformation? And here's a very important information. The metrics for the level of incentives in agriculture by OECD is the producer support estimate. From 1995 to 2017, the level of incentives to Brazilian agriculture was only 1.6%. That is because until the 90s, there was a net transfer from agricultural resources to other sectors. But what is amazing, when we consider this very low level of incentives in Brazilian agriculture, for example, in the US is 13%, in China is 14%, in Europe is 27%. If you go to Asian countries such as Korea or Japan, it's more than 50%. But the amazing thing is, farmers, they will promptly respond to market signals because there is no incentive for them to make decisions. And this is very important when studying Brazilian agriculture. Trying to put some thoughts to finish this brief talk. Challenges for the future, huge. on the demand side, on the supply side. But remarkable scientific advantages are taking places. For example, research from Embrapa with soybean. That's what we discussed it here at the Wilson Center a few months ago. We know a lot about the soybean plant, right? So Embrapa partnered with Fiocruz in Brazil and NIH here in the US. And that team, they changed the soybean plant, genetic engineered the soybean plant. And the soybean plant is producing substances to treat HIV. This is huge. This is amazing. That's what we call biofactory. Instead of producing those substances in a factory, we are using the plants to produce those substances. Just a quick example of that. Another thing that I would like to research, I would like to highlight just to finish. Brazilian agriculture has today 68% of the agricultural product in Brazil is explained by technology, 68%. Labor explains a little bit more than 20%, and land explains less than 10%. There is no future in agriculture for development. The future is in a science-based agriculture for development. So the key, if we are not able to reduce at least a bit market imperfections, it will be very difficult for technology to reach farmers in Brazil and make another transformation in Brazilian agriculture. And why was that? Technology works, you have a universe of technology. If you have a negative or unfavorable relative prices, the universe of technology shrink. If you alleviate barriers, if you alleviate market imperfection, the role of technology, the availability of technology stretches again, and you have better technologies promptly to be used for increasing production. Last not least, human capital, international cooperation remains key. And that's it. Coming decades can expect a lot of good things from Brazilian agriculture. And now I'll go back to Azoni with regional aspects. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Carlos Azoni, University of São Paulo. I also would like to thank the invitation to present our thoughts here and also pay a tribute to my dear friend Werner Baer, whose book is all his idea and endeavor. We just carried on. I'm talking about regional aspects. As you know, Brazil is a big country. I don't have to pray to the core. But it's few people know that or think about it is the size of US, continental US, or the size of the Europe of the 15. It's huge. It's huge north-south. North-south, this is what makes regional inequalities happen because of weather and so. So this is a chapter with Eduardo Haddad. So we have huge disparities. We can look at it by concentration or inequality. The first thing I will present is concentration. I use the center of gravity, which is the average latitude and longitude weighted by the share in GDP. So in one specific year, it means nothing, but we observe the movement of the center, and it is pulled by the shares on GDP. So if we show it, as everything in Brazil happens in Minas Gerais, you know. So the center is in Minas Gerais, but as I tell my co-author is from Minas Gerais, and she's very brags about Minas. I said, well, it doesn't matter anything. The movement is what matters. So whenever, this is the Northeast, the poorest part, and our regional problem, as we call o problema regional. So we need the point to move northwest, right? Let's see what happened. Starting 1939, which is the first year we can have it, we have the 50s going southeast, and then the 60s going north, and then we have the Brazilian miracle going southeast again, and then we have the right after the Brazilian miracle, going left, going west. Then we have the lost decade. We have more going to the west, pulled by agriculture, as Geraldo mentioned. And then in this century, we have now, for the first time, is going on the expected direction, and I could put an arrow there, not any adjustment, econometric adjustment, just illustrating arrow. So only now, after many centuries, as a matter of fact, Alexander Rands has the other chapter on regional aspects. It's only on the Northeast. He has a nice exercise to showing the share of the Northeast income on Brazilian GDP. It never, well, it was good until 1700. And then after the gold rush in Minas Gerais, it decreased. And for this period, it never reached half the Brazilian per capita income level, and that includes the Northeast. That means that it's even farther than the other states, especially in the South. So this is about GDP, so it's production. Let's see about how it works by sector. So in the upper left corner is the same picture, is net total GDP. I wonder if I have, oh, I do. It doesn't show. In the center up is agriculture, and the right top is manufacturing. So in manufacturing and agriculture, we don't have the northeast trend about the same time period. What we have in the lower left and lower center is commerce and services. So that's the part of the economy that's moving to the Northeast. And here I have financial services that has been talked about, and there's nothing about financial sectors in terms of trend. So this is production. Let's see about income. And for income, we use PNAD. Again, the upper left is GDP again, the same as before. And then on the right, top right, we have total income. You see that the trend is going the other way. On the lower left is labor income, is also going the other way. What's going to the Northeast is other sources that includes pensions, includes Bolsa Familia, social programs, and other sources that you can find in PNAD. So we can see this also by income class. We've been discussing how inequality is a big issue. Again, the upper left is total income. Then we have the center top is the three lowest deciles, 30% lowest income levels. They are going to the Northeast. And the income is growing. Lower left is from 61 to 90. Lower center is the top 10%, and lower right is the top 5%. You see that, summing up, we are having commerce and trade fueled by income transfers, a huge increase in the demand for wage goods in the Northeast, and some plants moving to the Northeast spontaneously, and some others with high influence of Banco do Nordeste and BNDES. But what we are experimenting is a tertiary economy change, and especially low salaries, that's wage good sectors related, and very large influence of the social programs. So that puts, this is before the crisis and before the change in government, and let's see what comes later on. So we have other signs of concentration. This is manufacturing value added per square kilometers. This is scientific collaborations, and this is a schematic map of Brazil, and you see that São Paulo and Rio are the magnets. If you go to different types of science, on the upper left is agricultural sciences, center biological, upper right health, and then lower left, I don't know what that is, engineering, agronomy, engineering in the center, and social sciences in the lower right. So a huge concentration of knowledge production, and of course, it has consequences. Another thing is about São Paulo metropolitan area, huge concentration in Avenida Paulista and Avenida Faria Lima. Everything is there. There is a discussion in the literature of urban economics whether cities are monocentric or not. It is monocentric. Living costs, of course, this is a setback. You have concentration, you have more income, but living costs are very high. So those minarets, which looks like the mosques, are the by municipality rent costs, and 409 to 2010, the last census. You see, this is the line, the orange line is the national average. You see in each and every state, municipalities above the average and some municipalities below average. So, okay, São Paulo has more productivity, but it has also more wage cost, living costs. So maybe people in São Paulo on the net gain is not that good, which is not the case, I'll show. This is by type of the city. This is the first one here is São Paulo. The second are Rio and Brasilia. The other metropolises are the other capitals, big capitals, and then you have, true, cost of living increases as the city size. It makes a difference. If you take the per capita, the nominal per capita income in São Paulo in Pinhade was 1,800. And in Campina Grande, 750. So it's a huge difference. But when you consider that Campina Grande is very cheap to live, São Paulo very expensive to live, the difference is Campina Grande used to, a person in Campina Grande used to have 42% of the nominal income of São Paulo, but in terms of real income or purchasing power is 87%. And the Gini is much lower if you take the corrected income. So does difference in cost of living equalize well-being in the country? Not quite so. I will show you soon. This is the total, it's total factor productivity in agriculture in 2006, the last census, before the one that's in the field. This is manufacturing productivity. You see that only one region in Bahia is better than São Paulo in terms of total factor productivity, and there you have 4 big guys in agribusiness. And some are the same as Metro, and then all the others are worse than São Paulo Metro. There is a concentration of productivity too. And this is returns to agglomeration. Does it pay to have a company in São Paulo, for instance? What's the profit? What's the upside if we know we have to pay higher salaries in São Paulo? So we are dealing with the private sector only RISE data. So this is the 27 largest labor market areas. We are not talking about cities here. It's a labor market area. It's commuting to work and study. So those are the highest. If you take Campinas and São Paulo, the wage level is 44% above the other non-labor market areas. If you control for the quality of workers present in those places, the difference are much lower. Brasilia, for instance, is 9% above average. given the quality of workers. Still, it pays more than it should for the quality of workers. We've been talking about that before, right? These public workers. Although here is only private workers. However, there is a contamination in the labor market, of course. If you control for the type of firm present in those cities, the differences almost disappear, but some like Manaus is paying less than it should be given the quality of the firms present there. If we control for both factors, I'm not getting into the details of this, and then typically you could say that what makes the productivity as seen by the wage levels in big cities is the quality of workers and the quality of firms. This by itself explains high productivity in those areas. However, our estimations show that if you double the city size, there is a gain in terms of productivity of around 10%, from 5 to 10, depending on the estimation. So concentration is good for productivity. So this brings one issue for regional policies. Okay, if we, as we discussed before, we need more productivity, maybe the best way to do this is through more concentration. And then you go again for the previous presentation when they talk about political possibilities. I don't think that's a way to go in terms of politics, of support for those measures. And then is by wage skill type. We show that the larger cities are the paradise for highly cognitive jobs and highly social skills demanding jobs, and not motor skills. Now talk about the final part of all the politics or policy. You all know the last election map. I will compare maps now. Now is HDI, Human Development Index, from 1991 to 2010. Huge increase, but still unequal. And now we can compare those. You can see that the colors are the opposite. So it's like the Northeast and the North, which are the poorest on the left map, all voted for the Labour Party in the second map. And that brings us the following question, Nordexit. Would it be a case for the Northeast thinking about regional separation, or and I argue it's not the case. I mean, this idea, it's in the, if you Google it, you find some people talking about it, but very, to say the least, exquisite people. It's not an issue. Maybe in the South, Rio Grande do Sul, they have the joke that the best state in Brazil is Santa Catarina. And why? Because it separates us from the rest. So, but it's even in the Rio Grande do Sul is not a big issue, separatism. I'm jumping this, and I'm going to one issue of competitiveness, which is infrastructure. It was being mentioned before. So if you take the quantity and quality of road infrastructure, for instance, you can see a huge concentration in the state of São Paulo. Very good roads, been there probably, and you know that. And especially in the West is very low quality that lowers the competitiveness of our agricultural products. We did an exercise estimating total factor productivity with and without infrastructure. This is the gross total factor productivity. This is when we include infrastructure, and this is the shape of the loss of productivity by lack of infrastructure. It's very important in the North and Center West, where the breadbasket of our economy. but it someplace else too. So the lack of infrastructure, the lack of a regional policy in terms of infrastructure is a regional policy itself, in the sense that it has regional consequences. So the last slide, what should it do? There is a huge debate in the literature about center-based or people-based or place-based or center. Well, you know the history, and Alexandre Randes in the other chapter deals about regional policy, or history of regional policy in Brazil, and some assessments. Typically subsidies to firms to move to the region. As I mentioned before, social programs. The Bolsa Familia, I have a paper on that. We have estimated it. Bolsa Familia is by far the most efficient program, regional program in Brazil in terms of reducing regional inequality. And it's not a regional program. It's a social program with regional consequences. It accounts for 25% of the reduction in the regional inequality. And it costed 1.5% of GDP. It's not, well, it's a lot of money, but compared to Sudan and other very expensive programs, it's, so you thinking about, you know, education and promoting social capital, human capital could be a way to go. And I mentioned comparative advantages there because this is what is present in the new government documents. It's funny. I mean, it's important to notice that within the presidential campaign, only Marina Silva and Ciro Gomes had some lines in their government plans about regional inequality. It's not an issue, apparently. But if you go to Brasilia, to the Congress, if you don't get the Nordestinos aligned with the important issues, especially now that you have to tackle banking reform, all the reforms were mentioned earlier, you need to create alliances. And one of the most important parties in the Congress is the Partido do Nordeste, which is an alliance of, you know, all representatives from the area. They fight among each other on other issues, but when it is to protect the Northeast, they are there, so you need them. So now we are dealing with this, waiting to see if we are going to comparative advantage, let the market decide what to do. And by my information, it will go to big cities, it will go to the traditional economic centers. But we are yet to see what's going to happen. Thank you.
So yeah, now we get to the future, where we see things going from here under new President Jair Bolsonaro. I have to stress this book was completed in outline terms well before the recent elections. Indeed, well before it appeared at all likely that Jair Bolsonaro was going to win. So we made no explicit predictions about the outcome of the presidential race, nor what the policy regime would be followed in the new administration. However, what does emerge from the volume are a number of axes of reform which we feel any administration would have to grapple with. And we've had some of these already highlighted in the presentations on agriculture and on the regional dimensions. And what I want to do, just to wrap things up, is to discuss that a little more broadly. and look at some potential priorities. And I guess the priorities have to centre on structural reforms, which of course we've already mentioned in the previous panel. And there's some debate about which reforms should be granted greatest priority, which is the most politically feasible, which has the greatest impact. But the same reforms come up again and again and again, and we'll just discuss that. But I think that, so there's a structural reform agenda, which is really, really clear. But there's also a broader political economy point, which is all about the need to reform state-business relations, to perhaps develop more arm's length relationship between state and business, and to remove the sense in which that success in Brazil's economy, whether as an individual economic agent, a worker or a business, depends on your proximity and connections with the state. Because I think all too often this has held things back and has resulted in clientelism and corruption and so on and so forth. So what are the likely pathways to reform, and what sort of things we'd like to see, what should be followed? I think the first thing undoubtedly we're going to see is a greater emphasis on fiscal orthodoxy for all sorts of reasons. And I think as that comes in, we're going to see a growth fillip, simply because I believe investor confidence will recuperate to the point where investment starts to ramp up, FDI begins to flow in again at an accelerated rate, and investors have got broad confidence in the macroeconomic stance of the new government. And I think that seems to be cemented in place by the appointment of Paulo Guedes as the new finance minister. And who knows, if rumours are to be believed, Joaquim Levy is a new director of the BNDES. So there are some pointers there. And I think the other thing that we're likely to see is increasing scope for private sector investment in infrastructure. As deregulation happens, as interest rates comes down, hopefully as there's a banking reform, I think this is an area where we're going to see some progress, and where there definitely needs to be some progress as well. As far as education, which is a priority which I emphasised in my earlier remarks, this is absolutely vital, but it's not particularly obvious what the new administration's stance on education is going to be in terms of ramping up investment. Signals have been so far rather vague, so we await to see what will happen there. And on the social reform side, social policy side, which has already been indicated as extremely important in explaining regional inequality, I think there is going to be relatively little novelty there. I don't see a new wave of social programs coming into place, but nor do I, or nor do others, I think, who are involved in the book, see the Bolsa Familia being eliminated. There were rumours that this would happen, of course, in the run-up to the presidential elections, and those rumours have been scotched. So I think the Bolsa Familia will remain in place. It's a fact of political life in Brazil, and it's a bit like the National Health Service in my native Britain, is that whatever imperfections there may be about it, it's become an article of political faith that if you want to get elected, you keep the Bolsa in place. I mean, the NHS, the National Health Service in Britain, was once described as the nearest thing to a national religion. And I'm not saying that the Bolsa is that, but it is, I guess, acquiring sacred cow status. So we'll have to see. But I don't think that Bolsonaro is going to touch that dial. So really kind of moving towards a summary here, I think the next 4 years will most likely be characterized by market-friendly reforms. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And in that sense, I think there'll be quite a strong parallel with the administration of Fernando Collor de Mello, who began in the early 1990s to open up Brazil's economy. The big difference this time round, the favourable difference this time round, is that there is going to be no desperate macroeconomic crisis in the background, no hyperinflation, no debt crisis. Brazil has very significant foreign exchange reserves. The Brazilian economy is growing, albeit slowly, and investors are not exactly pouring money into the economy, but they haven't lost faith. So we're in a much better place than we were back in 1990, and this provides, I think, a much better platform for the kinds of reforms which are going to be needed. And I think the sort of reform we're going to see are reforms which place the emphasis on the private sector to deliver the stimulus for growth, and which I think is very welcome, frankly. On the other hand, though, the state will still need to make strategic investments in education and, in some cases, infrastructure, and that will require meaningful fiscal reform, and it will require meaningful pensions reform as well. So, you know, the idea that the private sector can take up some of the slack, that's fine, but the state is still going to have to be there in critical areas, no doubt about that. Plenty to think about as we look over the next 4 years. Once again, I'd like to thank Paolo and everyone here at the Wilson Centre for the opportunity to speak to you all and for the opportunity to present our volume, which we hope will prove a useful reference source in the future. Thanks very much.
The book is available online, and you should buy it.
Please.
And it cost 100, and I saw it where? Cost $140.
Something like that. It's £95.
It's less than a good dinner at a good restaurant. So it lots of nourishment there. And I wanted to, well, do you have general questions for Geraldo, Carlos, and Ed?
I recently participated in a book publication on India, and obviously this was done mainly by Indians only, and they were very proud that the reform they started in the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, continued up to now with changing governments in a democracy which is even more difficult to temper than the Brazilian one. Why is it not possible that this wonderful example of agriculture can be transposed, for example, to industry, which has shining examples of very productive factories, but overall is still highly protected? And you hear words like, what we need is export incentives, but protecting imports. I mean, with that philosophy, that sector will not just, play a role, and services do not have indeed the dynamics which other service sectors in other developing countries, particularly India again, have. And I wonder this, that those things have to be tackled. And what do you think about that?
Can I add to that question? There is another example in Brazil that involves education, government focus at the beginning, high technology, which is Embraer, which is and international cooperation, which in agriculture with the United States mainly, on Embraer with the United States mainly. Embraer comes from a cooperation between the Air Force and the MIT. That from that came the Technological Institute of the Air Force. From that came Embraer. Is fair to say that Embraer is the other example, or is that too specific? I would like to understand that, because when you, for instance, when Geraldo starts talking about what's happening in agriculture, if you have not been in the first panel, you think that he's talking about another country, because it's almost the opposite, right? And so, first question. Combining our two questions.
Let me just make one comment on the return of investments to Brazil. HSBC was a huge, large European bank, which left Brazil altogether a few years ago, is now coming back, and coming back with great force into Sao Paulo. They're going to have 200 investment bankers in their new office in Sao Paulo. So you can see HSBC at least has some confidence that what's going to happen in the next 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. When you look at the success of agriculture, cannot there be lessons that could be replicated in other sectors? And I think there can be, around the deft use of market incentives. I mean, I think it does show that if you get the market incentives right, that people will respond accordingly. I think that's one lesson. And I think the other lesson is that the right sort of publicly sponsored innovation that connects with the need of a sector can work very well, which we also see in the case of Embraer. But the third thing I think that Brazil has in the agricultural sector, which of course cannot be overlooked, is just an enormous comparative advantage in terms of the sort of land it has at its disposal, in terms of the capital which has already been sunk into that land over the decades. So it always had that potential, and what seems to have happened is a deft combination of market incentives, perhaps some of them unintentional, and well-founded public sector innovation appears to have kicked off that sector. And of course, that's really on the supply side of things. On the demand side of things, this has all coincided with a huge increase in demand for foodstuffs, especially in China, and especially for meat products and soy, which is where Brazil has been able to fill the gap. So that's one thing. I think the Embraer case gets a lot of attention, and I think there are a number of things one can learn from that. One thing is that I think publicly sponsored innovation can be effective. However, it can only be effective where it meshes with global market demand, and where the sort of innovation which takes place is increasingly internationally collaborative in nature, as we're seeing with the association between Embraer and Boeing and so on and so forth. So there are lessons there really around the need to be, to have strategic priorities. I think that's very important, but to make sure that those priorities combine with existing sources of comparative advantage, but also where global demand is moving over time.
Just a quick comment, if I may. Very quick comment. One is that when you think about Brazilian agriculture, is the importance of the science-based approach, and that was truly a public good. So this was very interesting, and you saw the level of incentives to Brazilian agriculture. So Brazil had to develop that. And the second quick comment, in terms of comparative advantages, we can't forget that by late 60s, early 70s, several experts from the US, from Europe, they said, okay, you can't produce anything here in the Cerrado, perhaps, a good subsistence agriculture. And then the government at that time said, okay, I can produce a subsistence agriculture here because I have this huge urban migration in Brazil, and if the prices of food goes up, all the strategy of industrialization will fail. But then we joined forces, some guys in Brazil with guys in the US and Europe, and we start developing this tropical agriculture. Brazil is the first case of a successful tropical agriculture. So I think this is important. We can build comparative advantages. But again, the secret behind Brazilian agriculture is a science-based approach.
A quick comment on institutions. By now we know that Paulo Guedes has a big mouth, right? He speaks about things I think he should be silent. Anyhow, he had this line that he will save the industry in spite of the industrialists. You want to say that he's going to save the manufacturing from the manufacturers. And if you look at the representation of manufacturing in Brazil, Fiesp, FIENG, all the state association, or CNI, and if you look at the history of entrepreneurship in Brazil, Jacques Markovitch has 3 wonderful books on case studies. And all of those cases of success of Brazilian industrialists are heavily dependent on government deals. So some association with government, some of it we don't know, are touching the illegal part. So I think manufacturing in Brazil, especially with the leadership, the national manufacturer in Brazil typically is a person that pleads for subsidies or some protection. And we cannot compete with China. We need to be protected. And as far as you do that, you are immobile, you cannot go further. So a sort of cooperation between the manufacturers with a good eye for the future and government must come into place. So far, what we have is an alliance of that kind of industrialist, and typically they are able to appoint the Ministry of Industry, and there is a very bad alliance, and we have to cut that. And if we can do that, then we might have chance to have other Embraers or Embrapas.
Well, thank you. Marcelo, last question because we have to move on to the final.
Geraldo, how you explain the impressive performance of Embrapa in a country with so big political pressure? How was possible to be save Embrapa? What explain?
One thing that explains Embrapa is the commitment of the Brazilian government. I had the privilege of writing this chapter with Eliseu Alves, who is one of the founders of Embrapa. And he generally jokes that if Embrapa, the idea of Embrapa started a few years earlier, or perhaps a few years later, Embrapa wouldn't be this case of successful innovation. You need to understand that in the beginning, we didn't have tropical agricultural deliverables, right? So Embrapa started to bring something from the temperate regions and try to adapt, because you need to have some low-hanging fruits in every project. But this commitment of the Brazilian government, this commitment of understanding that to generate a good science takes time, the maturation time of research is not from 1 year to the other, it takes 10, 15, 20 years. So this huge commitment of the Brazilian government was really important. Another thing I would say that is this innovation thing about Brazilian agriculture. Embrapa always look to practical solutions. So Embrapa always work close to farmers, what their needs are. And again, this was also very important for this transformation. And very important, Embrapa is a big part of this agricultural research system. But when we are talking about this revolution in Brazilian agriculture, it's not only due to Embrapa. We need to consider the very important roles of state research organizations and the colleges of agriculture.
Everything starts in Minas. Come on, Yes, this is my grandfather's place. So, again, Minas Gerais rules. Now, thank you very much, Ed, Carlos, and Geraldo, for this wonderful presentation. And we will give it 5 minutes and start on the last.
So our final panel of the day is we're going to be looking at Brazil's changing political landscape and how that might impact the new administration's ability to respond to some of the challenges that you've heard about this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. We have Professor David Fleischer, Professor Emeritus with the University of Brasilia, Chris Garman, Managing Director for the Americas at the Eurasia Group, and our own Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute. Paulo, did you want to get us started?
Yeah, just to put this in context, what is the latest in Brazil? There is a major, or if there is hope from, after all, we have a newly elected president. The problem of legitimacy in government has been resolved. There was a problem of legitimacy following the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, although her successor was the legitimate elected vice president of Brazil. His performance ended up costing support and raising questions about the legitimacy, which was a point that her party, the Workers' Party, highlighted very much. Now, this problem is over. Brazil has constitutionally, not the other was also constitutionally elected, but was was a painful process. Was the second impeachment of a president in Brazil in 3 decades, in less than 3 decades. So it is, we are in a new plateau, more stable. Let me tell you a couple of things that I wanted to, just to, some parameters. You may have read a lot in the American press and the European press about the threat to democracy in Brazil, that the military are coming back and things of the sort. I do not share that type of anxiety. I think Brazilian democracy is obviously, has been under stress, but it continues to function, and it's now up to a new leader who has already held the Constitution in his hands on a couple of occasions, saying that this is the guide, this is what I'm going to resolve, this is the Bible, this is so. That is a source of reassurance because some of the issues that himself and others have contested, expressed very contrarian opinions, they are matters they are there in the Constitution, certain rights, certain values that are consecrated in that Constitution. There will be obviously lots of discussions. The other part that I'm curious about, and reading the media and listening to people's statements, you have to ask what is the depth of the new government commitment to the economic liberalization policies that have been announced by the chief economic advisor and future minister of the economy in Brazil, Paulo Guedes. And what is, and maybe more importantly, what is the capacity of the new team to make that happen through the legislative process, through the political process. It's much easier said than done, but the president was elected in a clear message of change, of rejection of what came last, which was more interventionist types of policies led by the Workers' Party for about, 15 years. You have a different scenario now. Another question related to what I just said, and I hope that David and Chris would be able to enlighten us on that, in terms of the new Congress. The new president, and the president-elect, spent 28 years almost in Congress. He knows Congress. He is not sort of a person from outside of the system. He's very much an insider. But we don't know much about the groups, the new faces that are entering Brazilian politics. We know some of them, but we don't know what that group will bring, particularly in terms of the reforms that Brazil desperately needs, as illustrated by the first panel when our friends from the IMF said, it's an economy that, if you look to the lines there in some of those graphs, to paraphrase something that Mauricio Mesquita Moreira from the IDB said here recently, it looks like, the Brazilian economy looks like an EKG of a dead person. It doesn't, it's there, it doesn't, it's flat, it doesn't move. It's a huge task, a huge task. Does the country has what it takes to move it, to reinvent itself? Yes. And Brazil has proved that in the past. It does have that. But governing is a complicated affair. The incoming group, especially the president and his chief minister, are have little experience in working under the hood of the state machinery. So obviously we have to wish that they will surround themselves with very able people. Someone just told me that, I think Carlos just told me that the nomination of Joaquim Levy as president of BNDES has been announced and confirmed. It's very good news, I think, for Brazil. It's very good news for me, because Joaquim is a dear, dear friend. When he was nominated Minister of Finance under Dilma,
1 year.
yeah, he came to the Wilson. The first place where he spoke about his plans was as kind of a background meeting with a
Off the
group of
record.
people. Yeah, it was a
I
chat-
was here. That was
well,
good.
a Chatham Rules meeting, and what's good about this is that I talked to Joaquim for about 1 hour last Saturday, and he was absolutely, quiet about that, and which is good. There is discipline, and it looks like there is discipline in the way they announce things, etc. It's a positive. But there is this, there are those doubts about maybe commitment and capacity to turn commitment into action. And the second thing, I think there could be quite a turnaround in terms of Brazil-U.S. relations. I think the two presidents are
More or less.
no, they are populists. They use social media to communicate to people. So the people in the bureaucracies in Brazil must be very apprehensive about that, because it looks like they could focus more on results than on process. The Brazil-U.S. economy, Brazil-U.S. relations could benefit from that, and it could benefit quite soon. There is one deal that is basically negotiated. It takes leadership, it takes a sense of direction from, especially in this case from Brazil, to make things like a partnership between Embraer and Boeing to become reality.
Work, right?
And because the preparatory work has been mostly done. So in that hopeful note, I would like to offer the floor to my colleagues here. Who goes first? David?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Well, it's good to be back here at the Wilson Center, and I thank Paulo and everyone here at the Brazil Institute for setting up this very, very interesting three-panel event today. And so I thank you all very much. As Paulo described, it's better if I have this microphone, as others have done. As Paulo described, we had a big game changer election. Well, what really happened? We had two big waves of public opinion. Number one, a wave of public opinion that you would say would be anti-Lula and anti-PT, and an alienation or disgust with our corrupt political system. Voters were saying, all politicians are corrupt. I won't vote to re-elect anyone. I'm going to search for a new, clean face. Well, Bolsonaro was able to incorporate both of these currents of opinion into his campaign as, in quotes, the anti-system candidate. Since '94, presidential elections in Brazil were polarized between the PT and the PSDB. But in 2018, the PSDB and the center literally disappeared. Alckmin, PSDB, Marina Silva, etc., did not advance in the polls. So there was a left-right polarization between the PT, the Workers' Party, versus Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro used digital campaign, had to use a digital campaign very effectively, social networks and social media. However, he does not use Twitter. That's what Trump uses. He tweets everything. Or just a quick sequence of events this year. In January, Judge Sergio Moro convicted Lula. And in April, the regional court in Porto Alegre maintained Lula's conviction, and he was finally arrested and imprisoned on the 7th of April, and has been in jail in Curitiba ever since. In August, Lula stubbornly maintained his candidacy, and the PT was forced to officially register his candidacy, with Fernando Haddad as his vice presidential candidate, running mate. On the 6th of September, Bolsonaro suffered a very vicious knife attack in Juiz de Fora and nearly died, but was saved by the doctors at the hospital in Juiz de Fora. That meant no more street campaigning for Bolsonaro and no participation in any TV debates. On the 9th of September, the TSE finally rejected Lula's candidacy. So I ask you a question. Where in the world was a prisoner ever a presidential candidate in a presidential system? Does anyone know that answer? It was almost 100 years ago. Here in the U.S. in 1920, Eugene Debs, who was leader of the Socialist Party, was a candidate for the presidency, but was in jail. Why was he in jail? Sedition. He was against World War I and against the U.S. participation in World War I. That got him in jail. Finally, Warren Harding, the next president, pardoned him. I think it was in 1921 or 22. So there was this precedent of Eugene Debs, but almost 100 years ago. On September 11th, the PT finally launched Haddad as presidential candidate, with Manuela Dávila from the PCdoB as vice president. Haddad then had less than 30 days to campaign before the first round. First and second round election results. Bolsonaro picked up 46% on the first round of valid votes, and Haddad 29.6%. On the second round, Bolsonaro won with 55% of the valid vote, and Haddad with nearly 45%. So the valid vote spread was, on the first round, 16.8 points, and the second round, 10.2. So now the anti-system candidate will have to govern within the system. The election was quite regionalized. This was touched on briefly in the presentation about regionalization in Brazil. Haddad won in 11 states, all of the northeast 9 states. That's where Bolsa Família is the strongest, and was created by Lula in 2003. Plus Tocantins and Pará. Bolsonaro, the PSL, won in 16 states, all the south, the southeast, central west, and part of the north. Perhaps 21 parties will be in the Chamber of Deputies, perhaps, and 15 parties in the Senate. We're going to have some parties be dropping out because they didn't surpass what we call the performance barrier in this election. So what about Bolsonaro's political support in Congress? It should be fairly broad, because he would need 60% of both houses to pass any constitutional amendments. Bolsonaro had very strong coattails. Coattails is an expression used here in the U.S. His party had 8 deputies and then increased to 52, with 4 senators. And 4 governors were elected, and many what we would call governors as joiners. Tomorrow he's going to receive 18 governors for a visit in Brasilia. There was considerable turnover in the Congress as well. The Senate had 54 seats up for election, 2 per state. 32 senators ran for re-election, but only 10 were re-elected. So we had 44 newcomers, almost 82% turnover. Many of the traditional parties were reduced. MDB, as you can see, got reduced in the Senate, PSDB, the PT, and also the PR. Other parties increased. The PSD increased a little bit, and the HEDGE as well. And 12 senators might migrate to other larger parties. Many prominent senators were defeated, not names that you may have seen before. Romero Jucá, Eunice de Oliveira, the current Senate president, was defeated. Roberto Requião from Paraná, our own Cristóvão Buarque in Brasilia, Magno Malta and Ricardo Ferraço from Espírito Santo, Lindbergh Faria, PT in Rio, Edson Lobão. The whole Sarney family was wiped out in Maranhão. No one got elected. And Cássio Cunha Lima from Paraíba. And the Viana brothers were wiped out in Acre. They had been dominating Acre politics for the last 20 or 25 years. 2 former PSDB governors were defeated for the Senate, Beto Richa, Paraná, and Marconi Perillo in Goiás, because of corruption accusations. In the Chamber of Deputies, elected all of the 513 seats, 52% turnover. Women increased their representation from 53 to 75, now 15% of the lower house. And one Indian woman from Rondônia was elected deputy. Traditional parties were reduced, as we saw in the Senate, PT, MDB, PSDB, PP, the Democrats, Democratas, and also PR. Other parties increased. As you can see, the PSL had a great increase, PDT, PRB, PSB, PSOL, and SD. The PRB has most of the evangelical deputies from the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. 32 deputies were elected by these smaller parties that didn't make the cutoff may migrate to other parties. President-elect Jair Messias, his middle name is Messiah, given to him by his mother, begins organizing his new government. As I said before, the anti-system candidate now has to operate and govern within the system. He has vowed to reduce the number of cabinet ministries down from 29 to maybe 15, 16, 17, 18, we're not sure, as did Fernando Collor in 1990. He reduced the Sinai cabinet down to 12 ministries. Eliminate ministries and combine some into super ministries. Reduce the number of federal political appointments. Organizing congressional relations. Should be able to build a fairly strong coalition. And Bolsonaro, as I said, was going to meet tomorrow with 18 governors in Brasilia. The Bolsonaro cabinet has some slots already filled. The Casa Civil, economy, defense supposedly has been filled by a general who went to the Supreme Court, is now going to defense. Justice, big appointment. Judge Sergio Moro, who was the main judge in the Lava Jato investigation and put a lot of politicians in jail, he's going to have an enhanced justice ministry. Justice, CGU, transparency, public security, and COAFI, all under one ministry. Infrastructure, mines and energy, perhaps mines and energy might be left as a separate ministry. Transportation, urban mobility, sanitation, telecommunications. He's already appointed or selected General Osvaldo Ferreira. Science, technology, and higher education. The idea is to take higher education out of the Ministry of Education and put it in together with science and technology. And that person is going to be Brazil's only astronaut who went up to the space station. As my nephew said, he's a Nazista because of NASA. Play on words. Play on words. So he's going to be the Minister of Science and Technology. He's an Air Force colonel, a lieutenant colonel. Agriculture has already had the first woman be appointed to the cabinet, Deputy Teresa Cristina, who's from Mato Grosso do Sul. She's one of the leaders of the Bloco Ruralista. Institutional security is General Augusto Heleno, who's one of the generals in Brazil with one of the best brains available. And so we're not sure how many of the other cabinet positions should be filled by the end of this month. Judge Sergio Moro was judge of the 13th Federal Circuit Court in Curitiba. He presided over the Lava Jato corruption investigation, convicted many politicians, not only from the PT, but MDB, PTB, PP, PR, etc. He convicted Lula in early January of 2018. Bolsonaro. Moro has complete full powers to combat corruption and organized crime. This appointment was criticized by some, especially the PT, because a lot of the PT people were convicted by him. So Moro then said, well, that must mean that I'm doing a good job. Moro's appointment is now being scrutinized by the CNJ, the National Justice Commission, as to whether he was playing politics as judge in order to try to get himself appointed to a cabinet position. These are the accusations brought to the CNJ. Probably nothing will result there. He resigned his judgeship at age 44. Bolsonaro might appoint him to the Supreme Court in 2020, when the first vacancy appears on the Supreme Court. Moro's temporary substitute is Judge Gabriela Hard, and she convicted José Dirceu. So she's hard. She's a hard line judge. Now this is Judge Sergio Moro and President-elect Bolsonaro.
Just one thing that Judge Moro and Judge Hart have in common is that they both spoke here. at those.
That's true. That's true.
Yes,
That's true.
sir.
Yeah, Moto's been here, and he's also been to Columbia University and given presentations
But,
at other places here in the U.S. Yeah. That's true. Anyone who's important in Brazil comes through the Wilson Center, of course.
We hope.
Well, foreign affairs. Paulo Guedes unfortunately disdained Argentina, said in an interview, Mercosur is a very low priority, and then he answered somewhat flippantly questions from an Argentine journalist. The first foreign visits are going to be to Chile, U.S., and Israel. Bolsonaro has made some negative statements about China. China has bought up many electrical installations in Brazil and is buying up Brazilian land. Bolsonaro visited Taiwan on his Asian trip, and of course that perturbed China considerably. But China has issued a cooperation statement saying we hope that Brazil-China relations continue to improve in the next government. He might transfer the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And of course, this has provoked a lot of negative reactions from the Arabs. Egypt was about ready to receive a delegation headed by the foreign minister early last week. But abruptly, Egypt canceled this visit by the Brazilian foreign minister. Of course, Itamaraty, the diplomat, said, no, the visit wasn't canceled, it was just postponed. Also, what will be Bolsonaro's policies vis-a-vis Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua? The ex-foreign minister under Lula, Celso Amorim, has been preaching against Brazil and the Bolsonaro government in Europe and here in the U.S., which is considered somewhat unpatriotic. Amorim is a vibrant PT militant. To answer the question that Paulo raised, is Bolsonaro a threat to Brazilian democracy? Because he was an army captain with considerable insubordination that got him in the brig several times, and finally his case was decided and he was absolved by the Superior Military Court. Then he resigned his commission and was elected to the Rio City Council and then 6 terms as federal deputy. Not considered a part of the traditional Brazilian political elite, although he'd been in Congress 6 terms. Because of his defense of the military regime and defense of torture while he was deputy, and very heated campaign rhetoric, he was described as autocratic, authoritarian, pro-military intervention by the international press, Europe and here in the U.S. These newspapers and press in Europe and the U.S. are somewhat linked to the Brazilian left. There was a study that showed that journalists here in the U.S. are mostly liberal Democrat and to the left rather than being Republican. Well, okay. Same. I would agree with that. Yes, okay. Bolsonaro has now vowed, as Paulo mentioned, to adhere to the 1988 Constitution and work with Brazil's institutions, Congress, the judiciary, public prosecutors, and federal police. So really, not at all, I don't think, he is a threat to Brazilian democracy, at least not for the time being, but we'll have to wait and see. Challenges for 2019, which some of the previous panels have talked about. Number 1, reduce and eliminate the federal public deficit, fiscal deficit. Eliminate waste and extra spending. Try to deal with the fiscal deficits, which are very, very bad, in states like Rio Grande do Sul, and Minas Gerais. Approve a Social Security reform, which is not going to happen this year, it'll be next year. This is the signal that investors are waiting for. When Brazil impeached Dilma Rousseff, investors said, great, you got rid of Dilma. Now, what is this new president going to do? We're going to wait and see. And the signal was the Social Security reform, which didn't happen. And GDP growth, new job creation. With new investments, this will help GDP growth and especially new job creation. Tax reform, simplify the tax structure. Reduce or eliminate the Ministry of Labor. It's now going to become part of the economy ministry. Eliminate side payments by new labor unions, which is a very corrupt practice within the Ministry of Labor. Reduce crime and violence. And then finally, Bolsonaro has said he will try to extradite the Italian terrorist murderer Cesare Battisti. So these are some of the challenges that face the new government in 2019. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, just to, before passing it to Chris, the challenges, or the main challenge is to get the economy, the Brazilian economy, growing again sustainably and creating jobs. This is probably what will be observed, what people will look into in about 6 months and decide if they made a good choice or not. But Chris, please answer all our difficult questions.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, it's just say it's a tremendous pleasure to be back here at the Wilson Center. It's always fantastic to participate in these high quality events. Paulo, you're to be commended with all the work you're doing here. So let me try to be succinct in some of my views, which is challenging given the fact that this was a unorthodox candidate who came out on top, and I think this is going to be an unorthodox administration as well. If I were to succinctly kind of encapsulate kind of where we are right now in terms of our thoughts of the new administration, I would say it's broadly, I think, constructive in terms of what we can expect. But we're in an environment of large tail risks, right? In terms of both to the downside and to the upside. It's important. So let me kind of unpack how I arrive at these conclusions. First, let's start with the good news. What are the things that we're not worried about? And I would echo Paulo, your comments and David's comments. I'm not worried about the quality of democracy being at risk in Brazil, even independent of the intent of the president-elect that you can get into a debate. When you look at what are the conditions by which countries have evolved into a soft authoritarian equilibrium, and we have many examples in Turkey, in Russia, in Venezuela. Usually, it's a president that's elected, surfing on pretty benign economic conditions, very high approval ratings. You use that political capital to overcome institutional hurdles through a referendum, constitutional reform, centralized policymaking in the executive office, right? We're not in this environment in Brazil. I mean, we're in a very difficult public opinion environment. This is an election marked by deep disenchantment over the quality of public services, voters linking poor public services with corruption. These are very difficult demands to meet. I don't think we're going to head toward an environment with an intense honeymoon period. In fact, I think that we're going to have a short honeymoon period for this new administration. And more broadly, Brazil's institutions are pretty broadly consolidated, highly decentralized, constitutionally independent judiciary, prosecutor's office, a Congress that impeached a president, a federal system that is fairly decentralized. If there is a crisis, the risk is to Bolsonaro's mandate. It's not to Brazil's democratic institutions. The other thing I'm not worried about is the agenda. That's not trivial. And Paulo's kind of question on the table. We have a federal deputy in Bolsonaro, who has been in Congress for 28 years. His track record isn't particularly encouraging. He voted against the privatization of state-owned enterprises. He said that former President Cardoso should be shot for his support on that agenda. He didn't support Temer's pension reform. He supports salary increases to the public sector. You kind of look at this profile and you say, this looks like a nationalist state interventionist. And then you got this guy, his main economic advisor in Paulo Guedes, liberal trained economist from the University of Chicago. He's saying that you need to privatize all state-owned enterprises, conduct a deep fiscal reform, and there's a true liberalizing. And then the skeptics are saying, oh, well, who should we believe? The guy whose track record, who's this nationalist or this liberal economist? And some of the critics are saying when the first sign of difficulty, he's going to abandon Paulo Guedes and go back to his roots. I don't buy that narrative. I don't buy that narrative. If you speak, once you do a little bit more digging and you speak with people who are close to the president-elect, the picture that emerges is essentially a candidate that had been meeting with economists for about a year and a half or 2 years, over the course of his campaign when he announced it 4 years ago. His son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, had brought some of this liberal thinking into the mix. And so you have a very slow conversion of the candidate to a liberal economic policy platform. At one point, the strategic decision was made that he's going to campaign on a social conservative platform and a liberal economic agenda on the other. After he made that decision, he brought Paulo Guedes into the mix. In other words, the sequence is very important. It's not that I'm going to get a good economist and then I'll figure out whether I agree with that agenda or not. No, that's not what happened, right? What it suggests to me is that even if Paulo Guedes doesn't stick around, that the agenda is going to stay. The agenda has got deeper roots than the personality of one economic advisor. That's point number, that's important to appreciate. And number two, many times the press talks about the structure of this administration. And when you look at the structure of decision-making of the new administration, it's very centralized. You have the president-elect, you have his three sons, right, who are in this kind of, circle of advisors. You have the president of the PSL, Gustavo Bebiano. You have the new chief of staff, Democratic legislator, Onyx Lorenzoni, and that's it, right? And then you got two very important figures that are structuring the government. You got Paulo Guedes on the economic portfolio, and you have General Augusto Heleno on the security and social portfolio. Those two guys are structuring the nominations within the administration. So you have a wing of the military and a wing of the liberal economists. And then the press sometimes says there are two factions. One is state interventionist. The other is liberal, kind of market-friendly wing. Who's going to win? And but that's also a mischaracterization. I think that the view that the military is state interventionist is an antiquated view of the institution. I think that we all have to become better students of the military as an institution in Brazil. We haven't had to study the military for a long time as political scientists. Now we have to go back to understand that. In speaking to the generals, what you really see is a military that is open to the role of the private sector and regulated sectors of the economy, even though you're going to have a general probably tackling the infrastructure portfolio and Osvaldo Ferreira. I think that, what I'm hearing is that the two sides are speaking to each other. They have a good agenda. There's no major policy divergences. So what that means, I think that we're going to get a good agenda. We're going to get good folks in key positions on economic decision-making. I think it's going to be a focused government on increasing the role of the private sector. It's going to be a free trade-oriented administration. The relationship with the U.S. is going to be a very good one. We're even hearing that initiations of a waiver towards Mercosul to initiate in a free trade agreement with the U.S. could be put on the table. Hard to say whether it's going to move forward, but I think unilateral reduction in tariffs. So I think that the private sector is going to love what they're going to see from the profile, the direction, and the policy orientation of this government. Okay, that's the good news. What is it that we're worried about? We're worried about the relationship in Congress and governability. Right? As I'm sure you've heard in the previous panel, Brazil is facing a major economic challenge, and the problems are fiscal, fiscal, fiscal. You have a primary deficit of 2% of GDP. You need to deliver a primary surplus of 2% of GDP to be able to avoid your net and debt gross levels from continuing to rise. The economic recovery depends entirely on the ability of the administration to make progress on tackling this fiscal hole. And the only way you can tackle this fiscal challenge is by approving constitutional reform on pension rules. And I would say that we're in a potential fork in the road, okay? Because if the administration is able to get something on pension reform, we could be in a positive, virtuous cycle, because you are seen as tackling part of the fiscal imbalances, and then you get all this good agenda of more heavier role for the private sector in oil and gas, logistics infrastructure, free trade, some of this having debureaucratizing, streamlining of licensing, and so on and so forth, right? And you have a lot of repressed investments that haven't been occurred over the past year because of the election risk. And then you can and we have a lot of companies that are cash rich and they're looking for investments. And we have offices in São Paulo, in Brasilia. We have a number of Brazilian clients and companies in the financial sector. I would say that there's an upside to growth if you're able to get that kind of stability and you tackle the fiscal. If you don't approve pension reform, we're in a world of hurt, because then the expectations on the financial sector will unwind, the real can go back to 450, the conditions for the recovery start to get stymied, and the government's approval ratings start to drop, and then you have an unorthodox president who's willing to blame institutional actors who get in his way, and then we can get into an environment of difficult economic environment and institutional tension, right? Our bet at Eurasia Group is that you get something on pension, right? But the path is narrow, right? And it's probably going to be very slimmed down. So let me kind of unpack the concerns and the risks for this. Here I would say, listen, the first thing to recognize is exactly what David just highlighted in his presentation, which is we have a president that was elected on a platform of changing the way politics is done. He was elected because he's not seen as a traditional politician. He say he's not going to do politics in the way that Brasilia is going to do. He has campaigned on an anti-corruption platform, and what he's saying is that he is not going to distribute cabinet positions in order to be able to have a coalition in Congress, right? That he's going to nominate ministers according to technocratic competence and what he views as the best person for the job. Crazy notion, right? But the problem is that violates the covenant of the way of getting things done in Congress. Because the grand bargain in Brazilian politics has always been that if you have a presidential democracy, you have 31 parties elected to the lower house. The president's party has 52 seats, but that's only 10% of the seats of the lower house, right? And so the grand bargain is, listen, I will vote for the agenda of the president, right? But I want something in exchange. I will approve reforms that are unpopular and I pay a price on my constituents, but I want to have access to pork and patronage, government appointments, budgetary amendments. And then
23,000 appointments.
23,000 appointments, that's a lot, right? And then the idea is I can pay a price on my votes, but I'll get something in return that will help me get reelected, okay? And it's to grease the wheels of your political machine. So the challenge is, how do you get difficult reforms done if you're not going to distribute pork and patronage, all right? We think Bolsonaro will distribute something. He will have to give second-tier appointments, budgetary amendments, not as if he's not going to play the game at all, but he's not going to give what traditional parties are used to receiving, right? And so that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is that we've had a tsunami in Brasilia. Half of the lower house didn't get elected, as they would give you the numbers. Very low rate of reelection in the Senate. And the bad news is you look at the composition of those who lost their seats versus the composition of those who kept their seats. And what we find is the legislators who supported President Michel Temer's difficult fiscal and economic reforms lost their seats in a greater proportion to the ones who voted against the measures. When you look at the votes on the cap on spending, which is a constitutional cap on spending, we did that analysis at Eurasia Group. Those who supported the cap on spending lost their seats by 50%, and those who voted against it kept their seats. So they had a 70% success of reelection. When you look in the Special Committee on Pension Reform, those who voted in favor of Temer's pension reform, out of the 17 who voted in favor, only 4 won their seats. So rate of renewal of close to 25%. And those who voted against it, 70% of them, 75% of them kept their mandate. Same numbers, a little bit smaller on labor reform. Maybe, one of the hypotheses is, okay, well, if you voted for these difficult reforms, you paid a price in the ballot box. Maybe. Another hypothesis is, no. It's that senior traditional established politicians generally support reforms, and they paid a price because they were seen as part of the establishment. Maybe. Maybe it's because they're seen as, closer to Temer. Maybe. It doesn't matter the reason, though. The fact of the matter is that reformists lost their seats in a greater proportion than those who didn't support the reforms. And then you look at those who are coming in. Okay, who are these guys, right? And then, it's harder, but what we're finding is that these are socially conservative legislators tied to the evangelical caucus, tied to the security caucus. They heavily play a role on social media to be able to get known in the campaigns.
Rural too.
So sorry?
Rural.
Agricultural caucus. So these are kind of, let's say, socially more conservative, but not necessarily more market friendly, right? And so, so again, you have a challenge of not fragmented Congress. You're not going to distribute the benesses to generate discipline, and a profile of Congress that doesn't look as reformist. So how in the heck are you going to be able to get a constitutional coalition to get fiscal reforms done? What the government is talking about and the plan of Bolsonaro is that they're going to negotiate with these legislative caucuses. We're going to negotiate with the agricultural caucus, with the evangelical caucus, with the security caucus. These are loose agglomerations of legislators that sometimes range anywhere from 100, 150 deputies each. And you look at the profile of the nominations, the new Minister of Agriculture, she came from the Agricultural Caucus. The nomination yesterday from the Health Ministry came from the Health Caucus. So it looks like Bolsonaro saying, I'm not going to negotiate with parties. I'm going to negotiate with these loose agglomerations of interest. I don't think that's going to work. These caucuses don't have a mechanism of disciplining their rank and file. They're effective mechanism of coordinating the vote on issues specific to their caucuses. But they can't kind of say, oh, I received something in the agricultural side, so you deliver me votes on the pension. There's no mechanism of enforcement. When you negotiate with party leaders have a mechanism of enforcement because they say, I strike a deal with the executive, and if my rank and file doesn't vote according to the deal, I'm not going to give you a budget or a committee appointment. I'm not going to give you access to the official party and electoral fund. You have tools to be able to discipline. These caucuses don't. They only meet infrequently, and they're only effective to coordinate on the issue. So I think that's a failed strategy, right? You wed the fact that this is going to be a very short honeymoon period. What do I think the best shot of this government is? You got to go for something very quick, and you got to go for something that you can easily sell to the public. Because if you don't have the public's support behind the proposal, right, and you don't do this very quick, you're in big trouble. Because the honeymoon's going to be short, your pool ratings are going to start to decline, and you have to be able to spin this and sell this to the public so that legislators think that this reform is on the public opinion side, right? The good news is the strategy in the economic team that we're hearing is an effective one. I think that they're not going for something big and something ambitious. And I think that the worst sign that we could get is let's have an aggressive fiscal reform. Let's try to have an ambitious proposal of earnestly tackling the fiscal challenges, because if they start with that, they're going to waste time. They're going to bring this to a vote in the second half of the year when your approval rating is starting to drop, and you're not going to have loyalty in Congress, and then the risk of not approving anything is higher. The only shot this government has is to go small, communicate it effectively, and bring this to a vote pretty darn quickly, right? So it's not going to be a one-all solution to the fiscal challenge, but if you can just get something done, then this kind of positive, virtuous cycle can happen. We're betting on that, but I'll tell you, I'm pretty darn worried that they'll fall flat on their face. I think that there is a real risk of that happening. And then if we're in that world, then of course, the economic recovery doesn't happen, the institutional tensions can come, and then we're in a vessel. So I think it is I'll just conclude here and say, that the real, let's say, narrative that I think the media should be covering of this government isn't the threat to democracy, is how can this great new experiment of governing without distributing pork and patronage actually work in this environment? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for some very fascinating comments. I'm sure we're going to have some questions, so I just want to open it up. Yes, right here in front.
I'm very encouraged by your vision of a bright future for Brazil. I just want to say, inshallah, let's hope that it really takes place, as you say. But I'm a bit puzzled by your assessment of the relevance of the pension reform for the sustainability of all the other reforms and for Brazil. I have the feeling that this is what we thought sometimes in 2016, when the government was expected to pass a pension reform and then pass the expenditure cap, justifying it as a tool that would help pass the pension reform. And then in 2017 again, and now, in 2018, the reform was not passed, and somehow the markets were not spooked by that. And why do you think that this is a deal breaker now for the future?
Listen, that's a great and very important question. And, I've been doing kind of political risk consulting, and we work with financial markets. I've been my entire career, and I'm always astounded how the goalposts of what needs to be delivered is driven primarily by the external backdrop, right? So what happened when Temer came into office, you're exactly right. They said, you know, he can deliver a cap on spending, but if he doesn't deliver pension reform, then it's all to naught because we're headed towards an uncertain election without a fiscal anchor. And then, you know, the government was 2 weeks away from approving pension reform. JBS scandal came. The government almost fell. They didn't deliver it, and markets were like, we can wait until after the election, right? And the backdrop, of course, is that, you know, we had an environment where concerns of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates abated. We had benign growth in U.S. We had, you know, let's say, benign liquidity. And so you had a more benign environment for emerging markets. And then in that context, Brazil and other EMs didn't have to deliver as much, right? Listen, could we have a benign global backdrop in which you can get away with not delivering pension reform, and similar to what happened, you know, under the Temer administration? Yes, right. But I would say that the distribution of risks on the global backdrop is actually getting worse rather than getting better. You know, we have growing concerns of a trade conflict with U.S. and China. Our own house view at the Eurasia Group is that this is going to get worse before it gets better. We're probably in a period of normalization of interest rates with the Federal Reserve. So I think that, you know, and also the longer that you delay this adjustment, right, the more vulnerable the economy gets. And we can see what happened with Argentina and Turkey, that you kind of delay adjustments and you eventually pay a price, right, in terms of from a crisis of confidence. The benefit in Brazil is that you have domestic debt rather than external debt, so your external financing needs aren't as large. You know, I would say, yes, it's possible, right? But I think that unless things get better on the global backdrop, right, I think that there will be a lot of frustration from market participants of not delivering something next year, right? And if we don't deliver anything next year in pension reform, what I'm hearing from our clients is that the real could go from 370 to 450. The conditions for the recovery could be undermined. You know, it's not a disastrous, calamitous scenario, but it's a very difficult scenario, right? So, I mean, I take your point that you got to take with a skepticism if you don't do this, then the world will fall apart that we hear in financial markets. Those things shift. And it could also get worse, right? Right now, I think that if he delivers just a very modest pension reform, which is get Temer's proposal in the plenary lower house, water down a little bit, I think markets are going to celebrate. But if the global backdrop gets worse, then maybe the requisite of what they have to deliver is more, right? Remember I told you there's a 4% of GDP gap, right? The Temer's proposal in the lower house right now only generates a savings of 1.2% of GDP, you know? So in other words, you still have much more to do, right? So in other words, even if you deliver some pension reform and it's a watered-down version, that doesn't do the trick, right? So,
well, our whole pension system problem is like a tsunami. The deficit is just increasing tremendously every year. And so as after the Wall Street blowout in 2008, many of the European countries were forced to do some budget adjustments and fiscal adjustment. The first thing they adjusted was their pension systems to increase the years of service and increase minimum age to retire. Even if, as Chris says, Bolsonaro is able to produce a more or less pension reform, not a strong pension reform, this is a very important signal or sign to investors, not only domestic investors, but international investors. And new investments, especially with innovation, are extremely important for our economy to create new jobs and reduce unemployment. And so the pension reform is a very, very important thing to approve in the first semester. Now, Paulo Guedes, our economy minister, has said, in the long run, we're going to try to approve a capitalization plan, which was approved by the Chicago boys in Chile, which means that all of the new people coming into the Social Security system, their contributions will be capitalized. Each one will have their capitalization account. And so when you retire, your benefits would have been capitalized by this capitalization system, maybe 30, 40 years from now. So his idea is to approve this capitalization scheme, which doesn't affect the current system, but would affect the system in the next 20, 30, 40 years. But it is the reform that has to be addressed. Well, the other point is that Temer backed away from his reform because he decreed a intervention into the state of Rio. And the Constitution says that when you have an intervention into any state, you can't approve any constitutional amendments. So couldn't do anything.
Yeah, just to stay on this is now the capitalization program that Gad is proposed. This is for the country of the future. Exactly. Remember, we are the country of the future. So in the future, we will do that. But right now, what we need to do is what you were saying. And let's see, and this will depend on, I think Bolsonaro will be measured. We will see Bolsonaro in action, because this is a function of presidential leadership. You have to lead, and you have to go to Congress and convince your former peers that this is good for the country, are going to do. And as Bolsonaro has surprised Brazil in his capacity to mobilize the electorate, well, let's hope that he surprises Brazil again, showing a political capacity for leadership.
He may use social media and social networks to do that, which he very adequately used to get elected.
I think, Paulo, what you just said is key, because if you're not using your traditional tools of disciplining of pork and patronage, right, it means that public opinion is going to matter a heck of a lot more. Yes. This is going to be a Congress that's going to be much more dependent upon how they perceive debates on social media and how this impacts their mandate. Even those who kept their seats, they're much worried about keeping their seats, given that half of their colleagues lost their seats, right, in the lower house. Yeah. So Bolsonaro has got to grab the bull by the horns, and he's got to defend pension reform and convince legislators that doing a pension reform is equivalent and tantamount to combating the privileges of the public sector elite. If he doesn't get the public anger against politicians on the side of pension reform, then he has a weaker leg to stand on. True. You know, and so I think he'll do a version of that, but he needs to take the lead on the communication strategy, and he has to have a very basic proposal and not do the capitalization. There are economists within his team that want him to go bold. They say that, listen, this is the one opportunity. You gotta, you're at the beginning of the mandate. You have one shot of doing fiscal reform. So let's do a fiscal reform that earnestly tackles the challenges, and let's have a capitalized system, more aggressive cuts on spending over the next 10 years, and have a expected savings of about 1.2, 1.3 trillion. There's a proposal by Arminio Fraga and Paulo Tafner that was presented to the economic team. I'll tell you, if they go down that path, I get worried because I don't see room for that. I think that the best shot is to go small and go quick.
Political, right.
Other questions? Here in the middle. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much for all these thoughts. I'm curious about one thing that I don't think has come up in this could be the most consequential aspect of the term, and that is his stated wilderness areas in the Amazon. How likely do you think that is to actually occur? What might be the
Who would like to take
Well,
that?
we've had some examples of that right now toward the end of Temer's administration. We have all of the environmental protection people who are going after the loggers and other people breaking the law and cutting down the Amazon. And they have been attacked physically with guns and also burning their vehicles as well, and have had to request the intervention of the armed forces and the national security force. So already in Temer's administration, there are strong challenges from those doing the burning and the cutting down of the Amazon against the environmental protection people. Whether Bolsonaro will continue that support for these people with the national security force and the armed force, we'll have to wait and see. I expect that he will, but that's my own personal opinion.
What I would say is just that I think if you're talking about the approving, for you to be able to do away with kind of these environmental, say, areas that are protected, by Brazil's legislation, and a lot of this has to do with indigenous areas that are protected by the Constitution, right? It's very hard to imagine that we're going to have changes in legislation that will do away with the large swaths of the Amazon that are protected legally, right? I think that he wouldn't have a majority to be able to do those type of things in Congress. So I think that it's very hard for him by executive decree to engage in the deforestation and the doomsday scenarios that we're seeing a little bit in the press. The issue, though, is if you have an administration that isn't committed to environmental protection, you don't have funding of the Environmental Protection Agency. You don't have as much enforcement on some of these areas. So can we have the Environmental Protection Agency and IBAMA not getting as much funding and backing to be able to enforce what's in the legislation? Yes, I think that could happen, right? We're already seeing this under Temer to a certain degree, but I would say it's more of a slow burn, no pun intended, than a kind of radical undoing of the legal protections that we're seeing on the environmental side.
Just two thoughts on that one. This is going to happen not only if it's Brazilians meeting and deciding what to do. Brazil made certain commitments internationally. There are conventions. There are there's pressure, and there are, especially in Europe, the threat of a reply of sanctions, depending on how Brazil goes about. If Brazil decides not to fulfill its own commitments that it freely made, approved by Congress. The Paris Agreement, for instance, Bolsonaro initially decided that we are going to leave the Paris Agreement. Not anymore. He decided that, and this is apparently a harder decision of moving the Brazilian embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Well, that's under debate because there is $7 billion of exports of meat or industrial product to Arab and Islamic countries, and this would suffer. So there is the international context is important. In the internal context, I have been following this. I think the part of what we call the environmental community, including scientists in Brazil, highly respected scientists in the public sector. I believe Embrapa will play a role in this because Embrapa is connected to the most advanced type of thinking in terms of agriculture, which requires environmental preservation. Is the science-based agriculture that is very important, that Geraldo mentioned. And I believe that the military can play a positive role in this. Remember one thing, the people in Brazil that are really connected to indigenous communities, that are really there, that are taking care of people, are the military. So it's not that, people want to open the Amazon and the military, let's burn it. No, it doesn't work like that. I think it will be an opportunity to engage internally in Brazilian society in a very important discussion because this issue has been evolved in Brazil in a positive way. I covered the Rio 92 Earth Conference, and at that time, Brazil was in the Middle Ages regarding this issue. Brazil today is up to the task, and actually there was just an exchange I saw on Twitter between the ambassador from Norway
Yes.
and Lorenzoni. Because Lorenzoni tweeted something about the Amazon Fund, etc., and the ambassadors. Yes, and there is going to be lots of communication in here, and we know because we are close to some of the people in the agricultural community, producers that are environmentally responsible and know what needs to do and what cannot happen because it would be to the detriment of Brazilian exports of agricultural products.
Yeah, there's very, very important points, Paulo, and I would just kind of piggyback a little bit on your comments and just say that what's unfortunate about such a polarized environment is that the quality of the debate in the press is very poor, right? So it's like, oh, we have a very conservative kind of neo-fascist president who wants to burn down the Amazon because he doesn't care about environmental protection. But there is an agenda of modernizing Brazil's environmental licensing laws, which is important, right? Because there is a point of the agriculturalists that they have, is that for you to be able to obtain environmental licenses, the bureaucracy is tremendous. You have risk-averse environmental agents to be able to sign their name for environmental licenses for infrastructure projects or even for agricultural projects. So there is a pathway to modernize environmental legislation that can expedite the ability to conduct investments, but not a detriment to keeping kind of environmental preserves. And you look at some of the agricultural producers, they say, listen, we don't need to cut down virgin rainforest. There's a lot of arable land to be able to cultivate that does not have to get into the rainforest. And so the problem is, how do you have a government that can actually, there's a good and legitimate agenda, but it'll be characterized as anti-environment. Not to say that Bolsonaro doesn't, I don't think his weights are maybe appropriately distributed in terms of protecting environmental, but I think that there is an important agenda to be there. So there's a point from the agricultural lobby that we can't ignore entirely.
Kent in the middle. Wait for the mic. It's right behind you.
Thank you. Kent Hughes here, a public policy fellow here and a sort of a junior assistant to Paulo on some occasions. That I look at this wonderful chart of the Brazilian legislature. It looks like a multicolored rainbow, but no assurance of a pot of gold. I remember the military government attempted to create a more European or more North American style political structure. Is there any chance for a kind of political consolidation in Brazil? And if that took place, might that ease the problem of Bolsonaro, any future president?
Well, yes. One of the problems that's described as you look at your rainbow is that there are so many parties in Congress. As I said, and you mentioned 31 parties in the lower house. However, 7 or 8 of those parties may disappear because we have a new clause that was passed last year, which is a performance clause that says if your party did not get 1.5% of the national valid vote, your party doesn't receive any money from the party fund and doesn't have any access to free campaign time on television. No money, no TV, that will kill almost any party. So a lot of those parties are now looking at mergers with other larger parties, and their deputies will probably transfer and migrate to other parties. Then, as of 2020, for the 2022 general elections, the reform passed last year says, okay, for electing deputies, no more political coalitions, no election coalitions to elect deputies. We have maybe 10 or 12 or 15 parties that can only elect one deputy because they participate in coalitions. So that's going to be another reform that will further reduce the number of parties in the lower house. Another reform possible would be we have a proportional representation system. Lots of countries have PR, but ours is the worst possible because it doesn't, in Europe, you vote for the party, and that's it. You vote for the party list. In Brazil, there's a party list of candidates, but you can make an individual vote, and 95% vote for an individual candidate. And then you have very, 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 very weak linkages between the electorate and the elected deputy. 6 months later, no one can remember who they voted for. So another reform might be close the party list and vote only for the party and not for the individual candidate.
Other questions? Over here in front.
Hi, Ryan Berg with AEI. Before I ask my question, I just want to not forget, Chris mentioned a sort of antiquated idea or view of what the Brazilian military is all about. There was a good report done by Luis Bittencourt and Florida International University Press like a week ago or 2 weeks ago on Brazilian military culture. So good report to review for up-to-date information.
Father.
Yeah.
He was the first director of this
So
program,
My question concerns the ability or the future trajectory of the U.S.-Brazil relationship, particularly with respect to the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, Itamaraty. From my experience working with them at the State Department, they can sometimes be a difficult partner for the U.S. And Bolsonaro has talked about sort of in rhetorical flashes like ferreting out particular ideological biases within the ministry. But I think what's actually there, besides those rhetorical flashes, that there are vested interests that might work against any sort of bettering of the relationship between the U.S. and Brazil. So, wondering if you have any comments on how he will either work with Itamaraty or work around them or work to change the culture there. Any sort of roadblocks that you foresee the foreign ministry putting up, with the caveat, of course, that we don't have a name yet for.
We don't have a minister yet. There are a lot of speculations as who that might be. Most of the speculations say it will be a professional diplomat from within the foreign ministry. But Bolsonaro said quite hard, we will no longer have any ideological biases in our foreign relations, neither right or left. And we won't have any ideological biases within our foreign trade either. Now, whether that's going to make Brazil-U.S. relations any better, we'll have to wait and see who the new minister is going to be and who the secretaries of various areas within Itamaraty are going to be. Probably there will be an improvement with U.S.-Brazil relations, I would assume, but not totally, let's say.
Yeah.
Well, let me add something, and after this I have to run because I have to give an interview here on this floor, right? Yeah, yes. Our TV studio. But and thank you very much for being here. On this question, first, there is a name that is being speculated about, José Alfredo Graça Lima, who is a very experienced Brazilian diplomat, a great person, who would very well implement a presidentially mandated direction. I think part of this, as we can sense, and from exchanges of messages and other things, is that the Brazil-U.S. relationship will become important again for Brazil and for the United States. Presidential leadership counts. It matters. In the 6 years where two ideologically and stylistically compatible presidents of Brazil and the United States coincided in power, that was during the Clinton-Cardozo, there were some important initiatives. One of them, you hear about Alcântara, the agreement to launch communication satellites, American satellites, from the Alcântara base. At that time was on Ukrainian, I think, rockets, missiles. Well, that was negotiated by the two presidents, the two administrations, and then shelved by the administration of President Lula. It never left the Brazilian side of the agenda. Why? Because it's absolutely sensible. It may come back. I think there will be other things happening to happen there. But I think that there is a different disposition that could be translated into actual achievements. The two presidents seem to have, on the part of President Trump, we know he is, and there is actually a guidance from, as I understand, guidance from Washington to U.S. embassies around the world saying, focus on results, focus more on results, less on process. That would be a challenge for Brazilian diplomacy that loves process. But I think that would coincide with the instinct of Bolsonaro. Let's focus on results. I have an article going that I hope to send today or tomorrow to a paper in Brazil. I think I see the Embraer-Boeing deal because that is a deal. It's done. It's negotiated and ready to sign. It make absolute sense. It has the support of the Brazilian Air Force, and well, it needs leadership. It needs action. Let's see how that goes, and obviously, you know all the pitfalls. We know where the resistances could come from, but well, presidents are there to lead and are here to lead. Let's see if they are capable, able to exercising that leadership and resolve this unrealized love affair between Brazil and the United States that existed for what, since the end of Second World War.
And Paulo, I think you've been
Why
summoned.
is the Alcantara base so important? Why does the U.S. want to use this? Because it's so close to the equator. The closer the launch site is to the equator, the heavier payload you can produce for the same thrust. That's why the Russians their base is so far north of the equator. They have to have huge rockets to launch their things into space. Even Cape Kennedy is is farther away from the equator than Alcantara. Alcantara is just below the equator. So Alcantara is a very important launching site because of this proximity to the equator.
Great. I think we have time for one more question if we have any. Up here front.
Can I just ask about reputational risk of based on things that Bolsonaro has said or reported to said, and sort of how he's perceived? Are we hearing anything how that might affect commerce here from the private sector, or do they feel that it doesn't matter to them as long as the economy is improving?
Yeah, well, good question. I mean, what I would say is the fact that the coverage of this administration and President-elect has been so poor, of being, a threat to democracy, of kind of not let's say harsh language, against minorities. Certainly didn't do particularly well with the female vote in the election. So, are there some companies in the private sector who are a bit concerned about being associated with this administration? Or we get a little bit of that, but to be honest, I don't think it's going to be a major impediment from FDI and investments. Multinational corporations are used to dealing with governments and countries of various different political colors and stripes, and ultimately, if in fact, we're correct that this is not really a threat to democracy, that there is a lot of hyperbole in some of this language and coverage, and if you have a president that's working within kind of the rules of the game, and the more he participates in international events, I think some of that hyperbole will start to die down. Not to say that we're not going to be in a polarized environment in Brazil. I think it will. I don't think Bolsonaro is going to tame his rhetoric tremendously. He was successful in playing to this anger. I don't think he's going to change entirely. So things like if Folha de São Paulo, a newspaper in Brazil, criticizes him, he says, I'm not going to give any publicity to a newspaper that engages in fake news, right? He'll use that rhetoric, which is very similar to what we're seeing in the United States. Look what happened with CNN, right? Just what Trump did here this last week, right? So I think we're going to get that kind of colorful rhetoric, but I don't think it's going to be to the point of meaningfully impacting investments in commerce and growth.
If we look at the survey research done by the Datafolha and also by Ibope, early on in the first round campaign, they broke down their interviews by sectors, and at that point, let's say in late August, early September, Bolsonaro was not doing that well among women voters. But toward the end of the first round, these two surveys, Ibope and Datafolha, showed that he was winning more support from women than Haddad was. And so the women came around, mostly because of the problems that he was addressing, anti-Lula, anti-PT, and especially anti-political system. And the women, he then had a majority of support from women. Among the religions, the only religious group which was not very favorable to Bolsonaro were what we call the spiritualists, the Kardec spiritualists, who are quite a large religious group in Brazil.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming and thank our wonderful panelists as well. for sharing their insights. And I'm sure we'll be doing more events in the future, so stay tuned.